Yeah, like. Yes, excruciating.
Welcome back. We will now enter the Village Council work session for March 12th, 2024. We're all present and accounted for, so we can go to the first item, which is discuss possibility of accepting Midland Country Club roads. Interesting topic. And here comes the man with the answer.
Did Jeff abandon you?
He got out pretty quick. I know. I can handle it. He'll come in a little bit, hopefully. So good evening. Yeah, I just wanted to have a little bit of discussion about the streets in Midland Country Club. They are currently private roads, private streets, not maintained by the Village of Pinehurst. There are approximately 1.5 miles of roadways in that subdivision. There are 94 duplexes, 47 duplexes, so 94 units, 94 residences, plus 5 single-family homes in that subdivision. It is 100% built out, so there's a total of 99 homes in the subdivision, and the owners of those roads have approached the village about the possibility of the village accepting maintenance on those roads. I have gone out and done an assessment of the roads in the subdivision. I think they were constructed as with the original subdivision in the early 1980s. And some portions of them have had some upgrades, but the majority of them have not. They've actually held up pretty well, being that they've been around for over 40 years. I have done an estimate of what I believe it would cost to upgrade those streets to our current standards if we were going to go in and resurface them using the unit prices that are in our current resurfacing contract with Fred Smith Company, and it's roughly $310,000 was the number that I came up with. That is not a given number. We would have to bid that out, but that is the cost to upgrade those roads based on current unit prices in our current contract. We met with the HOA fairly recently about that. They were going to go back to their homeowners within the subdivision and talk to them about the possibility of expending $310,000 or so in order to upgrade those roads so the village would take those over. But they were a little cautious about doing that if they spent the money to do that and then the village council would say, nah, we don't want to take those over. So wanted to have a discussion about that just to make sure that you all were comfortable with that if we do indeed start going down this path with them. We would put it on them to pay for this, but ultimately, if it is done and done to our standards, we would then take the roads over if you are agreeable to that.
Could you describe, again, you did it at the beginning, the makeup of the housing in that community?
Yeah, there's 47 duplexes, so 47 that times 2, so 94 units, and then they're actually kind of spread out in their 5 single-family homes. So it's a total of 99 residences.
Wow.
Ever come up before?
Not to my knowledge, at least not since I have been here for the last 5 years.
You're asking specifically about this neighborhood?
Yeah, if you're
or,
asking about
you know,
this
not that
neighborhood.
I'm aware of.
Who is the owner of the roads? Because the owner of Midland Country Club is Pinehurst Area Realty.
They are the owners of the roads.
Okay, so it's Pinehurst Area Realty Incorporated that actually owns the roads.
That's my understanding. Yes, they're the ones that made the request to us.
If I could use this template that you sent me 8 years ago to ask questions?
Correct. I've done an analysis of it, and like I said, there are some issues. Hey, Jeff. Yeah, there are some things as far as street signs that aren't compliant with our current standards. They're minimal expenses. The main expense would be to upgrade the.
Well, as I understand it, they are 60-foot wide right-of-ways.
That is correct. There
Okay.
is a 60-foot platted right-of-way on all of the roads.
Great, because
Correct.
that's what we're looking for. stormwater, I mean, in there, I don't think there's if there's a handful of drains, I'd be surprised.
Correct.
Is that an issue, do you think? coming forward?
Actually went out one day and looked at it after a rainstorm for that exact reason. There are some areas on a couple of the streets that hold water, but I think it's a matter of the fact that the roads have been patched so many times. There's puddles there. There are storm drains at the end of several of the cul-de-sacs. There is curbing throughout the subdivision. I did not see any issues of concern with related to the stormwater if the roads are actually paved.
There isn't
and
curb and
upgraded.
gutter, there's just an occasional curbing in where the
The
water would run,
asphalt
right?
wedge curbing, correct. There's not
Most
actual
part is pretty
concrete
flat
curb.
there. I mean, there isn't swales next to it, right?
Correct.
So is that according to our engineering standards?
If they were building them brand new, they would have to put concrete curb and gutter or receive a waiver from village council.
Hills or something like that?
But the swales are, yeah, they're fairly common.
How about encroachments?
Describe what you mean by.
Well, I mean, I know
that.
the driveways go in and there's, landscaping and so forth, but is there any potential serious encroachments as to buildings and so forth?
So there's water and sewer in the roads, which is, not uncommon. Those are owned by Moore County. I'm guessing there's some probably irrigation lines within the roads too for the golf course. We do not know the specific locations of those. There's some street lights within the main entrance if you come in off of Midland Road that goes in there. There's also some fencing there's some wooden split rail fencing along some of the streets, really right up next to the golf course. And there's some white out of bounds stakes associated with that too. So there are things that are within the right of way. Whether or not, as part of that process, we would ask them to move that, could be determined later. But nothing that really concerns me too much about a structure or anything within that right of way.
Okay.
So
If we were to accept the roads eventually, would we obviously, or would they also take the parcels that front on Midland?
that has not been part of the request, to my knowledge, Jeff, has it? It's only been to take over the roads at this time. So that's what I evaluated, was the roads and the actual right of ways themselves.
And of course, the sight lines on Airport Road are horrible.
They are not good. I would agree with that.
Almost been hit a couple times there.
Particularly when you're looking left, it's
Right,
hard
where
to
they
see back
really
there.
zip down that road.
Correct. But an airport is an NCDOT road.
That would have to be satisfied correctly, right?
So they're looking at hypothetically assessing everyone $3,000,
Approximately, yes.
and they fix the roads, and we take, do they get police protection?
They're already in the village limits, so I would assume they already get police protection, correct?
So they get ongoing maintenance after they bring them up to our standards?
That is correct. We provide them with solid waste service too, so our trucks are already going in there. It would just be ongoing road maintenance. If there's a pothole, we would fix it when it comes time to resurface these again in however many years. That would be on us and not them.
That's the trade-off.
And other places that have needed or have wanted us to take over, kind of what I'm understanding is that they had to bring them up to standard, and then we'd end up taking over the roads.
That's correct.
Standard.
Mhm.
Okay.
So the roads are not considered taxable property because they're part of the HOA common ground probably, is that correct? So we're not really losing any, are they?
Yeah, I believe you're correct, Jack, yes. They're part of the common grounds.
We would get a little bit of money. We get we do a Powell bill submittal every year to the state. We get money from the state for
Right.
road maintenance. I think I figured it up, and we would get like an extra $2,500 a year from the state for this. So, what's that at $300,000? It'd take us, 100 years to make up enough money
Right.
for that. But we would get a little bit of money from the state.
If we
took
were
them over.
to ask them to go ahead, with the promise that we would take them, and if, we would specify the exact specifications on the road and the drainage work that needs to be done, and we would be able to inspect that. And they would have to repave everything so that we've that would be our top-class road. We wouldn't have to address it for 10 years or.
That would be the plan, yes. And we even discussed, I might even suggest if we did that, we'll be putting out a paving package for our FY '25 road resurfacing
Include them,
package.
yeah.
Usually do that in July, so coming up fairly soon, and we could include this in there just to give them some economies of scale. We could oversee the project even too, and they would pay for it. I think there's several options to do that.
But we don't lose anything on it at all. I mean, it's almost a goodwill thing, but they got to fess up the money, and that'll be a serious effort on their part to get all those homeowners to agree to that.
Because of that, I think they pay $100 a year.
I know.
for their
Well, they don't have that much common
HOA
ground.
fee currently, so.
Right. Well, I've been down this road a little bit, as you know.
But there's de minimis impact, and we have 108 miles or whatever of roads now, so it doesn't really change our equation very much.
Doesn't.
The good thing is that it would give us roads that, throughout the village that, are up to standards and so forth, because it's not a private road, there's no gating or anything like that. It's just part of the village, so to speak. It's not like some other communities. I mean, there's no quid pro quo like there was in Cotswold, not the cut, okay.
What would have to happen before you came to us to actually, we're not being asked to make a decision tonight.
Looking for some direction here.
I think we're just looking for a head nod, like, okay, we think that this is something we would be willing to take over if they did the appropriate things. Is that?
So how would that work? That they would come forward eventually and say, we've got the commitment, you give us the commitment before they go out for contract, that type of thing?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to do it. I would think if they had the commitment for it, we could put it in our resurfacing package. It would probably help having a bigger bid package would probably help our cost as well for the roads we resurfaced. But we would split that out separately, and they would be responsible for that. As far as how the agreement worked and how the money would, be exchanged and all that, I think we'd have to work all that out.
As long as they bring it up to snuff, I've got no problem with it. I give a head nod.
Wouldn't it seem like a better idea if, as long as they were financially committed, if we actually did the work to be sure that it's up to standards?
That's certainly an option.
Well, we don't always physically do the work, we contract it to
Yeah.
reputable firms to do it,
Right.
yeah, right.
So we wouldn't have to worry whether it was up to, we wouldn't get into a debate about whether it is or isn't up to standards, because we would contract to have it done, and it would be done to our standards.
It would meet the specifications of our contract, yeah.
And it's not like they're creating a whole bunch of grass that we have to mow, or anything like that, right?
That's right.
There'll be low to no maintenance after built, is that correct? Okay.
So basically, if I get this right, this is our streets and their money. Too simplified way of simplifying it?
Their streets, their money.
Their
and then-
streets.
And then our money.
That
and then
become our
streets.
Then our streets, okay.
Yeah, their
It's even better
streets-
than I
Their
thought.
streets,
Okay.
their
Usually our
money,
money.
and then our streets at no cost.
So if they think they can raise the money from their community, why are they asking us to take on a road? Why would they want us to take on the roads? What's in it to them, for
I
them?
think- I think I can answer that in that the HOA is really the owners of the club. The HOA itself really doesn't have a body or a board. It's the two people who own it. They are advancing in age, and they are wanting to get the HOA actually fully established and turn it over truly to the residents.
Okay.
And that is, this road question was a big question of the residents about, in terms of creating a true HOA staffed by their residents.
Yeah, roads are always a big issue with
Yeah,
HOAs.
It's a big dollar figure, obviously.
But it presumably would not be bad for resale value or whatever
It
if the
could,
roads
it
were
could
improved.
enhance the community, I would think, a little bit. Not bad for us, and not bad for them.
More discussion? I'll entertain a motion.
I'm not sure if we need a motion, I just
A
think we need a
We don't need a motion,
consensus-
we just, a motion, we just need
consensus
to
from all
know
of
that
us.
if they brought them up to speed, this council would be
But-
open to accepting them.
Yeah.
That's all we need to know.
But what's the quid pro quo? Do we need to enter into some agreement with them? Or how do they feel safe that we're going to, we're going to do what we say we do?
We'll back out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, every 2 years you got to do it.
Right, yeah, just don't know.
Well, yeah, that's,
4
I
years, it
mean,
could-
that's why we're in front of this.
If we pinky swear.
Haven't heard that in a while, but,
You guys are in your seats for minimum of 2 years
Right.
amongst you. And as long as it was done within a time frame, we would be coming back to this
Same
collection
group.
of 5 who has, I think, all given us their opinion that, yes, we would take it. So whether they would take our word on it, I would hope the Village Planners' word is pretty good. But if we needed to enter into some type of agreement, we could. I don't,
how long will it take to do this? Pay for,
probably be next year, I would think.
Yeah.
If they elect to go forward, it would probably be done starting around this time next year, to be complete and then turned over sometime probably, April, May. And I'm only using our timeline right now this year, 2024, that our road resurfacing contractor is in town working now.
gotcha.
And usually it seems like they come after the first of the year.
Okay. Well, I'm comfortable with accepting this, but go
Aren't we
ahead.
really asking them to take the next step to really pin this down to a
Oh, yeah,
executable?
they want some general guidance as if they should bother to even try to get the community commit. That's what it comes down to, correct?
That's correct, Jeff. And so we agreed that we would bring it to you just to give tell us your general opinion that yes, if these are brought up to speed, you guys would likely accept them, or no, it's just off the table, and then they would still have to decide what they're going to do about their roads, because
Oh, clearly. Yeah, they've got some
coming
work
to
to
a
do
point
with
where
their
they have to do
community
something.
to do.
I sense we have a consensus then to give them a
Yes.
green light. Am I correct?
Mhm.
You got it.
Thanks.
So, thanks.
I agree. Thank you.
Okay. Review and discuss draft regulatory advisory roadway signage policy. There you go, Mike.
Fun stuff. Okay.
Oh, more
Um,
signs.
So, as I said in my memo, we've received, we seem to be receiving kind of an uptick in requests from residents to add various types of regulatory signage. And by that, I don't mean like street signs. I mean stop signs, speed limit signs is a big one, deer crossing signs, things like that.
Have we had any complaints from the deers?
We have not had any complaints from the deer yet. Just to kind of summarize that, I've got one request in my VOP right now to put stop signs at every intersection on one of our collector roads in Village Acres. We've got another one to add 4 speed limit signs to about a half-a-mile stretch over in the lake area. Another request to put a speed limit sign on a cul-de-sac over in the lake area. Another request to add a deer crossing sign because someone says that the deer like to cross in that area. And I'm not belittling that. I'm just saying, we do get a lot of requests for these. And we utilize, and the other one we seem to get a lot too is children at play signs. Hey, so a lot of them have to deal with more vehicular traffic and speeds of people coming through. We kind of have an informal policy, I guess, that says we don't put up the children at play signs. You can Google that and look and see that studies have shown that they're not really effective. They may give people a false sense of security. Hey, there's a children at play sign out. My kids can go out and play in the street. And people, drivers ignore them anyway. So we have kind of an informal policy that based on the studies that are out there, that we don't put those up. We refer to the MUTCD, the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, when we look at putting up signs and the requirements for that, but that manual doesn't cover every situation. So about 12 years ago, there was actually a study done, and council directed staff to reduce sign clutter around the village, both for aesthetic reasons and to avoid diminishing the effectiveness of those signs. So it was prior to my time here, but my understanding is part of what that was we took a lot of speed limit signs down, and we actually put at the entrance of most of the subdivisions, speed limit entire subdivision, speed limit 25 entire subdivision. And now you see we're getting, we do get additional requests. Well, we need more speed limit signs up from the residents. We've put together a kind of a simple policy that I'm asking just for your consideration on. And again, it's a work session item. I'm not necessarily asking for adoption of it tonight. Doug kind of headed this up. We did get Chief Webb's blessing on this as well. We got Alex involved in this too. So it's a basic policy that kind of says we're going to keep signs to a minimum and only be used where they convey essential information. I did find, I've done a little bit of research on this. There was actually a town in Wisconsin that had a little policy on this, but I wanted to read something I saw in there. It said, there are widely held misconceptions that speed limit signs will slow the speed of motorists, reduce collisions, and increase safety. Most drivers drive at a speed which they consider to be appropriate, regardless of the posted speed limit sign. Before and after studies have shown that there are no significant changes in average vehicle speeds following the posting of new or revised speed limits. So just want to make sure you guys are on board with that. You know, as people ask us to put more speed limit signs up, that our policy is generally we keep those at a minimum. You know, most of the documents that I see say if you got a speed concern, direct them to your local law enforcement, which is what we have done as opposed to putting more signs up.
All right, scroll up a little more. See.
Oh, am I doing that? Can I do that? Oh, there we go.
Okay. Following signs. Oh, yeah, I remember.
So we say speed limit entire subdivision at the entrances, and then we've got no parking in the right-of-way signs there as well. We
Let's
have
go
a
back,
li-
you know,
yeah.
there was a number there that I remember, 2,500 feet.
Correct.
How far is that? I'm trying to gauge.
Mile.
Half a mile.
Well, yeah, okay, but, so it's
About,
from,
about 100 feet less than a half a mile.
Yeah, exactly. Good, it's a good round number.
okay.
We also kind of listed out the signs. I mean, these are kind of signs, okay, you kind of know where you're going to put them, like stop sign, do not enter, one-way yield, you know, school crossing, no U-turn, things like that. I mean, these are going to be used, they're not necessarily limited in number, but they're contingent upon the needs of a specific location. And then we've got certain signs like deer crossings where we're going to be very, very limited in their use just because we're not so sure how effective they are. I don't know that we have a single deer crossing sign that we maintain. I think DOT might have a few around here, but but we don't have any. So, you know, there are some areas with active community watch programs. Talked with Chief Webb about that, and if they wanted to coordinate with the village PD to install community watch signs, that would be fine. And those locations would need to be approved by the village manager and the police chief. And then just this statement that the village generally does not install children at play signs because numerous studies show that they are ineffective, create a false sense of security, and do not normally reduce the speed of traffic or make drivers more observant.
And they stay in place after the kids have
Well,
up and gone away.
it could be new kids. That,
You know, we could only hope. But,
yeah, all right.
on a policy right here, I'm very supportive of making evidence-based decisions. So when the science is showing it, and I am not a sign expert, but if we've got a bona fide organization that looks at signs and what helps and what doesn't help, I think we need to follow that.
This looks like a solid policy to me, yeah. I'm not a big sign guy. I mean, if you're a licensed driver, you should know the rules of the road and be understanding that what the speed limit is and so forth. Now,
other thoughts?
you know, like blind driveway and so forth, those are occasionally important because you don't realize it.
Yeah, and we do give ourselves the ability to put those up if there's a specific.
Some of the curbs in a
Instance.
driveway coming out, you know, I know there's quite a few of those in the village, and there ought to be where they're appropriate, right?
Yeah, we had a situation out on Monticello actually where there were 3 or 4 vehicle accidents over a period of years at kind of a sharp curve, and resident requested it, and we got with Jeff and with Chief Webb, and we've put up, you know, the curve signs there. So there are going to be
How
times,
about the
certainly.
golf, do we have a golf cart crossing sign?
Yeah, we actually put that up here with,
Oh, okay.
placed in appropriate locations based on traffic or topographical needs. Yep.
How many neighborhoods have active community watch programs? None. Okay.
I know there's some places that have signs up, but whether
I
they're
know,
considered
I've seen-
active community watch programs,
seen
yeah,
a
I'm not
couple, but
aware of
we-
any.
Those signs, we used to have a more active program, and it's kind of died due to lack of participation.
Guy who ran it died. The guy who ran it died.
Well, there's, yeah.
I mean, he was behind it, and
And it never really was, it was more of an information sharing and deal than it was an actual community watch. We didn't have people out actually kind of patrolling their neighborhoods and looking for things that were
Do we have something
place.
on our website about it, though? If a community watch? Why do I think I've seen that? Maybe it's,
Might have found another thing in our website that ought to be updated.
every now and then I go to the website.
Again, I like the spirit of the policy here, getting back to it, the signs, using signs. It's data-based decision-making, evidence-based decision-making. If we see stuff that's occurring in our village in which we have increased accidents, we need to address that. We see issues where there's blind driveways, we need to address that. Anything that it's obviously coming up to be a problem, or is very potentially going to be a problem because we see it from other patterns, I want to make sure we have the flexibility to do that. But let's not just be putting up signs to put up signs. That's on there. Okay.
All right, any other thoughts? I think we have a consensus here
Okay,
that you should proceed with finalizing the draft policy.
we'll finalize the draft policy and submit it back to you for final adoption.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
thank you. Fund balance policy discussion. I assume this is Dana.
All right, good evening.
Go right ahead, Dana.
Let's get this up here. The PDF of the presentation, please. Whatever is up there is fine. Perfect. Thank you, Shannon. Yeah, I think just the, okay, that works. Thank you. Let me zoom this in a little. All right, so we're here to talk about fund balance. I know this is something that over, at least from the documentation I found in researching this, since 2021, or since 2020 or so at least, there have been a few different presentations to council discussing what fund balance is, what our policy is. So we're going to revisit that this evening and hopefully have some good discussion about it. At its very core, I think this quote here that's a recommended practice in state and local budgeting gets to the essence of why we have fund balance as a government. And it's because we should maintain a prudent level of financial resources to protect against reducing service levels or raising taxes and fees because of temporary revenue shortfalls or unpredicted one-time expenditures. A previous council member during one of the other presentations on fund balance had four kind of keywords that came to mind that I like, that I think really are applicable and are good to keep in mind through this discussion. And that was consistency, predictability, flexibility, and stability for our taxpayers and our organization. So those are the things that really, that's why we have fund balance, and we want to maintain a certain minimum threshold. It means that when something unexpected happens, we have the flexibility and the resources to react in a way that doesn't have to be making budget cuts very quickly and abruptly, or short-term borrowing when we're not kind of already in a position where we're doing that regularly as part of our cash flow strategy. So it's something that kind of protects the village so that we're able to operate pretty consistently. There's four primary, when we get more specific, four primary reasons that we have fund balance. The first is we need to provide cash flow when our current revenues may not be sufficient to fund our current expenditures. Half of our revenues are from our property tax collections, and those are very cyclical. We receive almost all of it, about $13 million between August and February. And then we draw from that cash that we've received through the remainder of the year to fund our expenditures. 57% of our budget is salaries and benefits. That's not really a discretionary expenditure that if some of those revenue dollars that we anticipated were to go away quickly, we need to have some consistency and some flexibility to be able to continue to pay our staff to ensure that we maintain the high level of services that our community deserves. We also need fund balance to provide a rainy day fund for uncertainties. So this can be unexpected costs from extreme weather, any sort of damage or repairs that are necessary. Some of these unexpected costs could be reimbursable from insurance or FEMA, but those reimbursements can take quite a long time, months, a year or two sometimes. So we need fund balance to be available to cover those expenditures until we get the reimbursement. Another element is the revenue side, which is typically impacted by a major recession. We do have about a third of our budget that relies on sales tax revenue, which can be pretty sensitive to the economic cycles. So if during the Great Recession in 2008 through 2010 or so, the sales tax revenues declined 25% over 2 years. So it was a pretty significant impact. But fund balance allowed, village operations to continue, at least without having a severe negative impact, or having to, do short-term borrowing or increase the tax rate just to make up for it or something like that. The third that we have here is providing funds for strategic opportunities. These are things that could come up from time to time that we do not anticipate in the budget, but we want to make sure that we have the flexibility to take advantage of them if it makes sense. This could be a property purchase. There's a couple other examples here where, maybe there's a purchase that's not anticipated, but circumstances come up to where it may make sense, let's do this now rather than next year when we were planning on it initially, for example. And finally, we want to make sure we're saving money for future capital. We do plan out our capital improvement plan in the 5-year forecast. So we're able to see at a very detailed level down to each vehicle we plan to replace, et cetera, each HVAC system that we need to replace in buildings. We can at least see when there's a year coming where there may be a higher than normal capital need. But those are typically years then where we end up using fund balance through a fund balance appropriation in the budget to cover those higher costs again so that there is no tax rate impact. We're able to maintain a kind of a consistent, predictable tax rate in the plan. We also will use it to build up fund balance for significant capital investments like buildings. That was done for the community center, and it's what we've been doing over the last several years with the library. One thing you'll notice is not on this list is it is never prudent to use it to fund recurring operating expenditures. So you do not want to be in a position where you are planning or budgeting in a way to where you need to use fund balance just to cover recurring operating expenditures. These are some factors to consider in establishing a good sound fund balance policy. It's primarily guided by the Government Finance Officers Association, or GFOA, and the Local Government Commission, the LGC. It's a recommended best practice, and our fund balance policy does meet all of these criteria here. The Local Government Commission does monitor fund balance level trends for a particular unit over time, as well as comparing those KPIs to its peers as part of its overall financial monitoring and review that it does of all the local governments in the state. They do make all of that data available publicly as well, so that we're able to see the benchmarks, which you'll see in a few slides. Both the GFOA and the Local Government Commission also emphasize how important it is to consider our individual government's circumstances and our situation and how that may impact our fund balance needs. Being a resort community or tourist destination, maybe a concentration of tax revenues in a few certain taxpayers, vulnerability to natural disasters, et cetera. And finally, having a sound fund balance policy that we adhere to does positively impact bond ratings. We don't have one currently, but if we were to do that in the future, I think it would definitely be a positive thing working for us through that rating review process, that we have had a fund balance policy for a long time and that we have consistently adhered to that. So this is a quick summary of the fund balance policy here at the Village. It was originally adopted in 2003. And there's kind of one relatively consistent element to the policy that's been in there since 2005, and that is having a policy that is a measure or a kind of a minimum related to the budgeted ending fund balance as a percentage of budgeted expenditures. In 2005, it was a range of 27 to 33%. Then in 2010, that was changed to a range of 30 to 40%. In 2021, then it was changed to a minimum of 30%, kind of removing the target range, because we then added that anything in excess of 40% of expenditures would be or could be committed for future capital. So that's since, for almost 20 years, that's sort of been a common theme, even though some of the other elements have changed throughout.
But, Dana, just as a practical matter, the Capital Reserve Fund is not restricted. We can move funds into it, we can move funds out of it. It's an account, I don't call it an accounting gimmick, it's an accounting discipline to segregate that which we have as quote-unquote a rainy day fund from that where we may have future plans.
So the Capital Reserve Fund that is referred to in the earlier years here was a true capital reserve fund, and under the North Carolina statutes, once you move funds into a capital reserve fund, they have to be used for capital purposes. You're not able to kind of flush them back and forth. That I think the restrictive nature of that, from reading back through the documentation as the policies were changed, I think that's a big part of the reason why it was then changed to just committing funds for future capital. It's still within the general fund, and that is a matter of council approving a resolution, moving it either putting that commitment on those dollars or removing it. So it gives a lot more flexibility.
Still use the phrase Capital Reserve Fund and?
No.
Okay.
No,
Thank you.
it's just a commitment, which is just an internal designation. There's nothing that truly restricts it solely for capital purposes. It does provide some transparency to our taxpayers that this is what we plan to do with those funds, but we still have the flexibility that if they were needed for a different purpose, an action of council via resolution would remove that commitment and allow it to be used for a different purpose. And I think it's also important to note that over the history of the Village's fund balance policy, it has weathered and kind of successfully guided the Village through the Great Recession, through COVID, through severe weather events like Hurricane Florence in 2018, and significant capital builds like the community center. So a lot has been accomplished, a lot of storms have been weathered, where this fund balance policy, I think, provided a great foundation that allowed the village to continue to be financially healthy and sustainable throughout those times.
I'd jump in and maybe ask Jeff for some of his historical knowledge. I recall that hearing soon after I started working here that back in that 2008 to 2010 timeframe, staff had to go through a pretty considerable cost containment process. Can you offer any insights on what that looked like for the village of Pinehurst, and to what degree the fund balance policy that was in place at that time played a role in that?
Maybe can answer some of that, best as I can recall. At that time, we embarked on what we consider to be more of a strategic or smart cost containment measures. It wasn't situations, we were faced with obviously a revenue shortfall and trying to, obviously hold the operating cost and expenditures going out the door, but we did not want to do it as a across-the-board cut. We wanted to be more strategic about where is things more discretionary versus maybe more important that should not be cut. And so we went through that process with capital projects that were in the works at the time, as I recall, backfilling positions that became vacant, or some of them going to be, can we live without that one for a while? Those kinds of things. Those were kind of some of the measures that were taken at that point in time. The fund balance component of it, I don't recall where we were exactly at that point, but we did have the policy in place that allowed us to absorb some of the impacts on the budget, the shortfalls in revenues, and being able to backfill with some of the fund balance in order to sort of
There were
bridge us over until things got better.
there were no layoffs or anything like that.
We did not do any layoffs. There were a number of positions that we held off filling.
But affected service delivery.
It did. Yes, that's a fair statement. There was not a layoff, but I can tell you that we reduced the inspections staff at that time, and we slid that position over into a maintenance role in order for them, until such time as they were able to find employment as a building inspector. So there were some things of that nature, but we didn't just flat out lay people off.
Right.
But to Jeff Sanborn's point, that would have implied that such inspections as were required would have taken longer to do because we had fewer people doing it.
Right.
Yeah, but and at the same time, there was the downturn in the residential market, and so the number of inspections
It may have been
was
offset
at
by that.
was at a point that we had more capacity than we really needed, and so that was another, I guess, if you will, smart type of reduction in cost. So we
Strategically smart reduction.
yes,
Yeah.
move this person over here to help backlog on some maintenance items, which then we could do internally, which are less expensive than contracting out, and then that bought them time to find a position, which they did in the building inspections arena. So in general, having the fund balance staved off tax increases at that time, staved off drastic reductions in operations, although we did have to make some adjustments to, that were.
So there were no tax increases and there were no layoffs
I
during
can't
this period.
recall if there was or not on a tax increase. I don't know if you're looking that up now. If there were, they were probably not as significant as they could have been.
I would have been surprised to raise
And-
taxes.
Man, and those, some of the more important capital expenditures, that's where the fund balance would be coming into play. I can't say for certain one way or another of whether they also were allocated towards a few operating costs to bridge the time, but I think probably most of it was still aimed at capital. Capital replacements, capital purchasing, that kind of thing.
2009, the tax rate remained flat. I'm looking at 2010 quickly.
Yeah, we had established a cost containment committee with the management staff and finance director, and so pretty much everything had to come through that cost containment group. Our approval of backfilling positions is a holdover from that, in fact.
Oh, really? Yeah.
So where that is circulated to you, me, Doug, Angie, that's a holdover from that time frame of when we were doing that cost containment.
Yep, and the tax rate remained flat during that period at 28 cents.
Don't know if I fully answered your question, but that's the best I can recall.
Yeah, no, that's it.
Thank you, Jeff. I think that really illustrates how complementary the the fund balance policy kind of underlies the whole strategic planning process and mindset that the staff have here. It's a very mature, robust process that I think, the examples Jeff gave where the first thing is going to be to take some prudent action of what can we do to try to maintain costs and reduce what's not necessary. But ultimately knowing that we have kind of that safety net of the fund balance to be able to avoid any really drastic actions that would impact the livelihood of our staff or something like that, or the impact to residents with services. So quickly we'll go over the three parts of our current fund balance policy as it stands today. The first part we're looking at, and we say at the beginning of the year, but really it's as we're developing the SOP and the 5-year forecast. We're looking at it from a budgeting perspective. So this is also considered to be kind of budgetary fund balance, where we're looking to make sure that our total fund balance through our 5-year forecast, that we maintain at least that minimum of 30% of budgeted expenditures. We need some sort of guideline when we're going through the budget process and we're working with just estimated and projected numbers that we feel confident kind of as things come to fruition and we're working through that time frame, that at the end of the day, we'll be in a good place.
What was the last year our fund balance availability dropped below 40%?
Below 40, we do have a graph coming up. The last time it was below 40, that's unassigned. It was FY21.
And in the succeeding years, it was up to,
Yep, then it went up to, it was 36 in FY21, 56 in 22, 65 in 23.
in the year before that, below 40, was it further below 40?
Yes, then in FY18 and 19, it was like 25 and 29%, but that's during the time frame that the community center was funded from fund balance.
So we dropped below our minimum that we,
Not below,
not below, I thought we dropped below 30, is what you said.
no, I'm sorry, I thought you asked 40.
Yeah, I did ask 40, but what was the number you used a moment ago? I
Oh,
thought you
this,
said 20
I'm sorry,
something.
yes, the 25 and 29. This is unassigned fund balance in the graphs that I have readily available here. I'd have to look through all the budget books, the SOP books to see,
Unassigned is different than total.
right, and we'll get to
Yeah.
that too as far as
Well,
these,
no,
the different terms that are
yeah.
used.
I've always worked off not the unassigned, the basic number.
Right, the
And
total,
I can't
yeah.
remember, you cited 1 year, but I can't remember us ever being very low.
Probably not. I'd have to look back through the SOPs and the various forecasts. I know at least our current SOP for FY24, in the last year of it, we end at 30% with that, the way that plan was structured. So with the anticipated spending for the library, public services, and other capital needs.
But that's future.
Correct,
That's
yes.
5 years from now.
Yes, well, we're only looking at
Okay,
this,
I'm-
we're only looking at the 30% minimum
Yeah, the
when
point-
we're projecting into
The point
the
is, the
future.
accumulation of fund balance was intentional in order to fund those future capital requirements.
Yes.
I understand, but what I'm hearing and thinking about is how it ended each year that we just ended. The future, I understand, that is a different issue, and that varies between, in a 5-year plan, as you just pointed out, sometimes the taxes went up, sometimes they remained flat. We were very fortunate not to have any layoffs or a tax increase during that period of, what do I call it, economic uncertainty, shall we call it? I mean, that was, I remember those years. So, okay, that's good.
Yep, so this is just so that when we're looking forward and we're projecting and we don't have those actuals to work off of. Actuals are part of what informs the plan, but it's not what we're looking at in comparison to making sure we comply with that 30% minimum of budgeted expenditures.
And slightly related, maybe slightly unrelated point, typically excluding capital items, we have quote unquote borrowed a little bit from the fund balance to meet the balanced budget requirement.
No, only when you include the capital. Our operating income has always been positive, and in the plan,
Right.
it's
But
positive,
in the
right?
budget, the prospective budget at the beginning of the year, I thought for this year, there was, for the current fiscal year, there was like a
There's usually fund balance,
$600,000.
yeah, every year there's some portion that's fund balance appropriated, but that's to cover operating and capital.
Okay, it's
yes.
not just operating.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and yeah, in the 5-year forecast that we looked at the retreat, that was kind of the preliminary for FY '25's SOP, you're correct that in some of the later years, there were instances where the operating income was negative. So but that's not our final version, right? That's before we.
Right, and that's
And
what I'm
that's what we'll be working through the rest of March is where do we need to adjust so that that's not the case?
That's what I'm
What makes it
focused-
work?
That's what I'm focused on, because if we have a large capital expenditure, that obviously is not going to be funded without, that's why we have in excess of 40% or some numbers.
Yep, exactly.
I understand the move, the $600,000, I recall that number now.
Yeah.
And I thought it was all for operating, but what you're saying is some of it was for capital.
That was all just to the remainder of what we needed to take from fund balance to fund capital. I guess it's a matter of which piece do you want to say
What
it's.
we had to fund capital.
Combined total.
I think it's fungible, right? So it just basically,
But
choose whatever you want. It's both of them together.
Total requirements.
Yeah,
I get that, but is there a distinction between the two? I understand funding operating, I get that. But what would we have put money towards to fund capital needs out of that 600,000?
so that was, when we built the budget, I think the capital, I think the operating was like 26 million, 26 and change, the capital was, I think, 2.8. Our operating revenues were, I want to say maybe 28 million or so. And so that shortfall of revenues in terms of our total expenditures, we needed 600,000 from fund balance to balance the budget.
So you could extrapolate 10% was for capital, 90% was for operations,
Yes.
based on what you had to start with.
Yep, and generally, that's pretty close to what the ratio is that we try to stick to. That's that operating margin metric that we focus on, and that is to ensure that our operating revenues are sufficient to cover all of the operating expenditures and a good chunk of capital. Because the capital can fluctuate year to year depending on specific needs or replacements, that's where the fund balance may be. The fund balance appropriation needed to balance the budget maybe more or less in a given year, but it's usually because of that fluctuation in the capital.
And some years you just don't complete a capital project that you had budgeted for, but for whatever
Correct,
reason you
yep.
don't get
and
it done.
That's when we get into the actual side at the end
Okay.
of the year. Yep, when we're looking at the other two parts of our policy. But you're correct, then not all of those, not everything that we budgeted for ends up getting spent. So then you end up with surplus, some of it carried forward.
And if
But-
I remember correctly, all this is listed on the 5-year plan, and sometimes it was 90% for operating, sometimes 89%, then 91% or 92%. It's all listed there on the 5-year plan, what we're trying to.
That's the operating margin number.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's right, yeah.
Gives you the extrapolation of how much was for capital, how much was for operations.
Yep.
Answer your question before.
Well, not really. It's really, it's telling us that
That year.
in that year, we
Correct.
have
Correct.
only 10% of our total revenues is available for capital.
Yep.
That might be in fund balance for future capital requirements, or it might be spent this year, or we might be spending more than that 10% that year because of the ebb and flow of capital requirements.
Other than that period of time in, I guess it was 2009 and 2010, have we ever had an emergency or an unexpected something that has occurred that caused us to have to do something financially that we otherwise really wouldn't have done? I mean, I'm trying to, we're not on the coast, we're not next to a
Right.
volcano. I'm trying to figure out, here we are in the Sandhills, what type of things have occurred or we're preparing in case they do?
Yeah, I feel fortunate, and there's an analysis that gets to this further along in the presentation. I feel like we are in a pretty safe space here. We are not really exposed to many wild risks or like wildly unpredictable ones. In terms of the weather, the most common thing is that we have thunderstorms with high winds, and we need, 25,000 to do the debris cleanup and dispose of it at the landfill.
I've often speculated that the most likely high-cost event that we would have to contend with is a direct hit by a tornado on our key facilities.
Low frequency, high
High
impact.
impact,
That's right, yeah.
exactly. Yep. Yep, so the other two parts of the policy, part two is that at the end of the year, when the audit is done, we're looking at our actual unassigned fund balance. That needs to be at least 15% of our actual expenditures as reported in the audit. And a second kind of companion element that we look at the end of the year, and this is a resolution that comes to council each June, is that when our total fund balance exceeds 40% of the actual expenditures, so if kind of, you can still see there's like a little hint of that 30 to 40% target range in here, where we're trying to maintain at least 30% as a minimum. But then at the end of the year, if we are over 40%, that's what we're looking at to commit for future capital, as long as it does not cause us to violate this 15% minimum in terms of the unassigned fund balance. There's a lot of different terms that are used, different kind of measures of fund balance. We have our total fund balance, which is all of the different components that you see in the audit. Our policy specifies unassigned fund balance as one of the measures. This is the accounting version or one component of our accounting per GASB fund balance. And it's basically what is left after you have identified all the components of your fund balance that meet these criteria, which are in some way either restricted or kind of earmarked, if you will. For example, the fund balance commitment for capital, and we have a portion that's for the library and archives, and the assigned fund balance that we report in the audit, we're required to report that way because we have already, council has already approved the budget ordinance for the upcoming fiscal year that appropriated that amount of fund balance. So we have to say that's kind of already earmarked for appropriation in the next fiscal year. So these two are internal earmarks, if you will, but that can be changed. That when you take our total less these elements, that equals our unassigned fund balance. That's the one that we need to hit at least 15% of expenditures to maintain that. Another common one is available fund balance, which is a different measure. And this one is calculated in accordance with the state statutes. And this is what one of the things that we report to the LGC with our annual filings. This, we're looking as a starting point are cash and investments, and we're deducting liabilities, open encumbrances and commitments, things that basically mean we already know that we have to spend cash for these things. So that cash is not available to spend on anything else. And so then at the end of the day for that calculation, that's how we get our fund balance available for appropriation. And these will come into play because you'll see not every entity, when we look at our peers, uses the same kind of basis for their fund balance policy that we do. With these different measures, just in terms of some of making the comparisons between the different entities that we'll use as our peers. Unassigned fund balance typically is going to be your smallest, the smallest dollar amount out of unassigned, available, or total. It represents what we have available to spend that isn't already restricted or earmarked. It can be used for any purpose. And our policy, that third step to commit the excess fund balance over 40% for future capital, makes this measure particularly low for us compared to our peers. And you'll see the peers we're comparing to are Southern Pines, Davidson, and Cornelius. So that does make it difficult to compare, but those entities don't have a similar policy where they commit an excess amount of fund balance.
Cornelius is a much bigger town than us.
Yes, yes.
Southern Pines, I thought their fund balance policy is at 25%.
It's 25% of available, yep, yep. Yeah, we'll get to theirs next. Available fund balance usually falls in the middle of unassigned, available, and total in terms of dollar amount. Again, it's kind of the cash that we have available to spend.
Dan, I'm sorry, just before you go, on the unassigned fund balance, you say that because we commit excess balance for future capital, that reduces that number for us, but Southern Pines, Davidson, and Cornelius do not do that?
Correct.
Hence, we will be lower than they are on a comparative.
Yep. So this is just a snapshot of the village's fund balance as of June 30th from the audit. And here's where you can see our unassigned fund balance is 5.4 million. But we have 10.5 million committed for future capital. Really,
Committed to future capital. That word committed is a very strong word. What does that word mean, committed?
that just means that council has passed a resolution saying that we would like this dollar amount set aside, saying that we plan to use it for future capital. And all it takes is another resolution saying we don't want to use it for that anymore to be able to change that.
So it's the creation of another savings account. in essence.
It's a more flexible way
Yeah.
to still be showing that you're setting aside funds for future capital.
Ask a different way, and I'm not asking you to do this. You could give us a list of specific items that would add to 10.57 million.
No, that's not the intention. That would be, I think more like if we had a capital reserve fund still, then you need to be more specific in what projects will be funded from that. This is meant to just sort of be a general bucket that we will use to fund capital in the future. So in the years,
Recognition of the fact that we have these big capital projects in the 5-year plan that we need to.
yes, or years when we need to draw from fund balance to cover all of our capital expenditures, that's basically where we're taking it from.
That is composed of the assumed price of things that we might or might not do in the future.
No.
Now, it's,
Get to the, how do we get to the number?
So
It's down to the dollar.
Every year when we, at the end of the budget cycle, Dana does the analysis, and anything over 40%, we come back to council and say, would you like to commit this to future capital requirements?
What if the council says no? What do we do with the money then?
then it all,
It just stays in the general fund.
it stays as unassigned. It would just,
be
it
an
would be
unassigned.
reported as
Yeah.
unassigned. Yes, so instead of having,
From time to time, council has said, let's put this in that bucket. Let's
Yes.
put this excess, if you want to call it that,
Yes.
money in that bucket.
That's
Yes.
right.
There is a list of projects that somehow would add up to 10.5.
there are projects where basically the 5-year
More. I
plan,
mean, in this
it
case,
adds
it's
up to
actually
more,
more. but,
right?
Yeah.
as you have pointed out before, John, we have a much more expensive list of a capital wish list, right? And this is not enough to cover it. But this is, if we go back to the policy here, so how that 10,000.
Recognize that the future capital requirements in our current five-year plan are in excess of that $10 million. So it makes sense to say, hey, let's just earmark that for capital.
But the way it's actually
It boils down to
calculated,
spending, as Professor Friedman once pointed out.
the way it's actually calculated is when we complete the audit, we calculate what is 40% of the actual general fund expenditures. And actually, probably if I jump down to this, 40% of our general fund expenditures in FY '23 was this $9,790,000. So any unassigned fund balance in excess of that amount is what then is reported as, that's where that $10 million number comes from. So we do the 40% of general fund expenditures is the 9.8 million there. And then we do have to go to the actual calculation here.
But this is all these capital money, assigned or unassigned, whatever, doesn't become, quote, my word, committed until the village puts out an RFQ or an RFP and says, okay,
Correct.
we're going
Till
to
that
sign
year
this
when you actually
contract
spend
to
the money.
spend this money.
Yeah,
Correct.
that's right. Yeah.
Then it becomes, in my opinion, committed.
Correct. Or until we actually transfer funds into a capital project fund.
The capital project fund is a different category. Okay,
Correct,
got
yes,
it.
but some of that, some of the use of that $10 million committed for capital could be transferred to the library capital project fund, for example.
Is there a project fund right now? And if so, how much money is in it?
Library.
Yes, we have the library capital project fund, and it has about 1.5 million in it.
Is that on this list?
No, this is just the general fund,
That's outside the general fund.
yeah.
So I don't want to believe, is another way that it's almost a plug number to get the total to be the 20.362.
No.
No,
It's a decision that the council makes at the end of every year. That's
For
Hey,
which
yeah.
there is no formula to add
There-
up a list
there-
of
be
things.
there, or it could be in the
There is-
unassigned fund
yeah.
balance.
There is a formula, but it is not, the formula, the way we come up with that number is not by adding up estimated cost of specific
It's
projects.
some other number times a percentage gives us that number.
Yes,
Fine.
yeah, once
I'm
you
good with
subtract out those other
Yeah.
minimums that we.
If
need
you choose to
maintain.
take that action, every year we come to council and say, would you like to commit this to
So
future capital
If
requirements?
next year you
Or do
don't,
that time in the future.
so for example, in FY '23, if council had not adopted that resolution to commit this money for future capital, the unassigned would have been 15,977,000 and change.
So we're engaged, but we're not necessarily married yet. It's
Correct.
when we put it in the,
Correct.
You're right.
then we're married, is that right?
I'm not even sure we bought the ring. but-
No, I think. it's
We're in a
way
relationship
off.
here.
We haven't even found a venue for the wedding. We were just, but let me go to, okay. For the last few years, I've very much first of all, I appreciate your numbers, your data. But I've always lived off is too strong a word, but I used the display charts of the 5-year forecasts. And I'm looking at one, this must have been last year's, 2023 through 2027, and then 2023 through 2028. And you have a FB, fund balance, percentage of total budget.
Yep.
And that's the number that I would always look at.
Mhm.
And I would get, I'll admit to being animated by it sometimes. It would be up to 55. At one point, it was at 72%. I'm reading right from this.
Mhm.
Then it dropped down to 47% in 25, down to 38% in 26. Now, again, this is a snapshot in that time. Things vary.
A snapshot of expectations as well.
Yeah, no,
right.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's futuristic, most of the numbers, but some of them are current year, 55.7%. And the same thing is with the estimated operating margin, which would be from 0.88 to 0.91, which is your ballpark, your range. So I guess I'm not confused, I understand it now. But what I'm seeing is that we're now saying that we shouldn't treat the total fund balance availability as a single number. We should break it out. We can't call it a capital reserve fund because that has all sorts of
Different
connotations
implications, yeah.
you had been using. But we can't just treat it as the cash that it is, because it is cash. Am I right?
For the most part, yes.
Yes, okay.
Depending on
But
which of these two
The
numbers.
numbers you're referencing are total fund balance.
Yes.
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 So it's all of this.
It's all,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it's the 20 million,
Yes.
okay? All
Yeah.
right. And if you go back over the years and look at it, that's what was always explained to me in the budget briefings, and I locked onto that. Which is why I think a fund balance policy is vital, okay? I think any community that doesn't have it must be Looney Tunes. My problem with our fund balance policy has always been the same thing. I just think it's a little too high. It's not that it's very, very good. I just don't think, I think that having it to 30 to 40% distorts things in my mind.
Right now, it's a minimum of 30. It's not a 30 to 40.
Well, the range,
Yeah, ours is set at a minimum of 30. It used to be a target range.
it was 30 to 40.
Yes.
And now it's 30.
The minimum is 30, but as I said, that range still sort of lives in the policy by having this component that
Except it's-
commits the excess over 40. So it's
That's just
acknowledging,
Beginning of year versus end of year. so-
yes, yes.
Well,
And,
it's
and
going to take a while to extract the 30, 40% range from
Yes.
my mind.
And
because
that's
that's
and
how
I
you
think that's fine.
raised me. You raised me on that number.
Your fault.
So, again, I don't know how anyone could fault how we manage these funds and how we watch things so that we don't face any catastrophe, which is why I asked if we've ever had layoffs or tax hikes. We haven't had to go through any of that, even at the worst moments of the fiscal situation of which we were not responsible for. Okay, we were just, a bystander, and it hit us. But I still, the number I'm focused on is the total fund balance one. And I granted, we have some future capital, and we have, the library we have some that's a hardcore commitment we have.
yes.
And then we have what we consider unassigned. I now understand how it's broken out this way. I'm just going to tell you that you raised me on 30 to 40%, and
I
you raised me on these numbers, and now you're telling me to,
I want
restart.
to say, I understand the right-hand side of this a lot better than the left-hand side.
And that's
Those are all hard numbers,
yes.
in essence.
And I think
Yes, right
an important thing to point out on the left side with these audit ones is really anything in this committed, assigned, or unassigned category. Now, to your point, Patrick, of the library and archives, there's a contractual
Absolutely.
agreement there, so that is a more hard commitment
Very
than
much so.
just, council choosing
It's
to
not only
earmark
here, it's a
something.
hard commitment in the minds of our residents, too.
Correct.
So it's not, the other things are very amorphous.
Correct, so that's why I
I
didn't
think
highlight.
Jack might say we're married to it.
That's why I didn't highlight that one for kind of inclusion in
hear
what
you.
truly we should be looking at as sort of the fund balance that we have available to use for any purpose, which really is the future capital and the unassigned. And, if you think about it in terms of in the next fiscal year, we're using that subsequent year's expenditures assigned amount of 600,000 for any purpose that we feel we need to. So really anything in the committed, assigned, unassigned categories generally you can think of as kind of one bucket of what we have available to spend. And that's when it gets you closer, the 16, almost 16 million number gets you a lot closer to that LGC calculation of our fund balance available of 17.1. the things that we do need to be mindful of excluding, and when we're looking at total fund balance, when we're looking at the budget and the 5-year forecast numbers, is usually we have about 3 million that is in this restricted for stabilization by state statute. And that's what the bottom of the right side calculation is. This is what a state statute mandates based on their calculation here, their prescribed calculation, that we cannot spend.
Remind me, the 1.4 liabilities, what is in
Yep.
there?
So that is accounts payable, what are the things?
Leases?
You have many leases?
Not much, but there is a little bit of lease liabilities.
What's an accounts payable that we carry?
That's going to be any,
Comp, would it be comp in there? Salaries in it? No.
no, well, there would be accrued salaries and
salary,
wages through
okay.
June 30th. It's in, accounts payable will be invoices for work done or goods we received
I
through
get
June
it.
30th. We just pay them in July, for
remember
example. Yep. So these are liabilities that we know that cash is going out the door in July or the near term. Encumbrances and commitments, those are open POs that we already have made a promise to a vendor that we are going to buy something from you or you are going to provide us a service, so we have to make good on that commitment.
I get it.
And that's basically then how we get to what's truly available. What have we not already made a commitment to spend or, to outlay? So just to kind of put in perspective what those two different fund balance figures are. So now comparing to some peers. So Southern Pines, Davidson, and Cornelius, I did not just throw a dart at a map and pick our neighbor. These are peers that have kind of been vetted through the strategic operating planning process with the balanced scorecard and our KPIs, where, through different methods, we've evaluated that these are comparable peers, ones that we want to compare ourselves against. So you can see here, we are the only ones that use total fund balance as a percentage of budgeted expenditures as a part of our policy. Southern Pines and Davidson do both use unassigned fund balance as a percentage of actual expenditures. So again, that's at kind of at the end of the year measure. Are we complying with our policy and kind of on target in terms of maintaining an appropriate amount of reserves? We're at 15% at that lower end, but that's, again, because we choose to have that additional commitment for future capital. Southern Pines is at 25%, Davidson at 35%. Available fund balance as a percentage of budgeted expenditures. Southern Pines uses this, both Southern Pines and Davidson, this is what they use during their budget time. This is their forward-looking, when they're doing projections, 5-year forecast. They're using this measure. So Southern Pines is looking to maintain 25%.
Right, that's,
Yeah, Davidson.
why do you have 34.7?
Theirs is interesting. So their policy minimum is that it's half of the LGC population group
Oh my
average.
gosh, okay.
So there's kind of like a moving target over time. But it's at least, it's close to that 35%. So we'll just call theirs 35 for simplicity. And then at least out of these peers, we're the only one that has something in our policy where we commit excess funds for future capital. For a comparison here, we have the budgeted expenditures, the original budget for each entity, as well as the actuals. These are the original budget is for FY23 as well as actuals. I'm sorry, original budget for FY24, actual expenditures for FY23.
There must be some anomalous reason why both Southern Pines and Cornelius were like $5 million below budget on expenditures. That's a lot. And they didn't do that by scrimping pennies.
Where do you see the, unassigned fund?
26 versus 21 and 35 versus 29.
Oh, okay. Yeah, as far as, how their surplus that they had at the end of, or budget actual variance rather. It could very well be some similar circumstances to ours, depending on how they utilized and recognized their ARPA funding, because that was a big.
Aren't I right? Cornelius is a booming, that's Lake Norman, am I right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, they have a
okay.
much,
So they're booming.
$10 million larger budget than us, roughly. Southern Pines is very comparable in terms of the budget and the size, and Davidson is a little smaller. But when you kind of translate those percentages to dollars, our 30% minimum based on our FY24 budget would be $8,130,000. Our unassigned fund balance minimum of 15% would be, 3.6 million, 3.7 million. So that's a pretty big range between those two times that we're looking at whether we're meeting our policy. When you look at the other entities, particularly Southern Pines and Davidson, because they also have two different measures, one for budgetary purposes, one at the end of the fiscal year, they both are kind of very close when they do their calculations. But again, they do not do the commitment of capital. That's what really drives our unassigned to be so much lower than everybody else's, which can make it hard to
Available
compare.
balance, NA?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Next line. NA, available balance?
So we don't have a policy that uses available fund balance as the base, kind of as part of the measurement, so that's why it's NA. It's not that we don't have any.
These aren't actual numbers, they're just the numbers that correspond to the percentages at the top.
Right, that if you were to calculate the minimum per the policy,
Okay.
that's what the dollars would be. Just to, if it helps put it in perspective and to kind of see what ranges, they're looking at.
Why is that our range in red?
I just wanted to, for it to stand
If I
out, the
was
fact that
listening?
ours is very large.
That's the difference between the 8130 and the 3671.
Yes,
Oh,
so,
okay, because they don't have a total fund balance
yeah.
number there.
But when
Okay.
you look at like Southern Pines, when they're measuring their available fund balance as a percentage of budgeted at 25 comes out to 6 million. When they look at it at the end of the year as unassigned fund balance, it's 5.4. They're only $500,000 difference. So they're getting pretty comfortable that, okay, yes, we're budgeting to hit a certain, or not maintain a certain minimum, but to be kind of compliant with a certain minimum, and our actuals at the end of the year are also in line with that. The way our policy is written, it's a little harder to gauge that. Some comparisons just graphically. This is the unassigned fund balance. The red line is our 15% minimum. And the green bars are the actual percentages over time. So again, in FY 18 and 19, it dips down. It built up as funds are being saved for the community center, dips down in 18 and 19 as the funds were spent for that purpose. In 21, it drops way down to 15% because that is when the fund balance policy changed to be a 15% minimum and commit the excess for future capital. So this is where this disparity becomes very large, but I think it's really deceiving in terms of what resources we actually have.
We voluntarily did that.
Correct,
Okay.
correct. We voluntarily do that, the other entities do not.
Yeah.
So this chart is adjusted to where we're now including the committed capital funds as well, to where it's more of that apples to apples comparison, if you will.
That's the
And
number,
now-
that's the numbers we were used to seeing, all right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So these would be more closely aligned with what we're looking at budget time when we're planning. This is the after the fact in terms of actuals, but again, more closely aligned to those percentages that we see in the plan.
Exactly. There's
Where
the
we're
dis-
seeing this go up as we're building fund balance for the library.
F18 and 19, once again, that's a reflection of the community center, right? Am I-
Yep.
it was- And then it started to accumulate.
Yep.
Okay, go ahead.
And then the final chart here to compare is related to the fund balance available, which is, even though we don't use that in our policy, this is the measure that the LGC is looking at in comparison to our peers and trending over time for us. And so the LGC will look within our peer group. Our peer group is municipalities without electrical systems with a population of 10,000 to, just under 50,000. There are 46 municipalities in the peer group, and the average population is 23,000, so our population's a bit lower. But within that peer group, the average expenditures were 24.2 million in FY '23.
And we're right there.
Ours were slightly higher. So even though our population's lower, our expenditures were a little higher than the average. But you can see we've generally, other than 19 with the community center, we generally kind of trended along with Southern Pines and, pretty closely with the peer group average.
The reason we're below the other two, again, is their policy of the way they think about future capital commitment.
And I think their minimums are higher. So Davidson was 35%, and Cornelius was 40%. So they're also managing to a higher minimum. But they also, who knows what their plans are, and specifically in terms of what they may be, saving for.
Accumulating for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've looked at lots and lots of explanations of what fund balance is, how we calculate it, how our policy works, what our peers look like. At the end of the day, I know the question that, and probably what you really want to discuss is it enough? Is it appropriate? And so the GFOA has a lot of resources on what they call risk-based reserves approach. And this is, it's one approach at how you can kind of look at how much fund balance do we need. I personally like this approach because you're building up and based on our specific needs and the risks that we face. And it also gives you the ability to build in what's our risk tolerance. How much do we feel we need to keep set aside versus how much are we willing to take a chance that we don't have enough. And so I found in 2019, the finance staff did actually work with the North Carolina Capital Management Trust and had done a calculation of what the appropriate level of fund balance might be taking this kind of risk-based approach. And so this is their calculation over here. And so they were summing up, if there were to be another major recession, we need to have about 2.4 million in reserves to make up for lost sales tax revenue. And there were some other elements here for economic declines in other revenues. That could be investment income is another one that typically can be sensitive to economic cycles. They had funds here for a major taxpayer default. I don't feel that's really a significant risk. So that is one that I don't think would necessarily need to be built into something like this today.
I think there are only two possible candidates for that. There's no individual homeowner or what have you.
Correct. And I think the nature of their businesses and even the value of their properties would be such
We're
that I'm
fine.
sure someone would purchase it before we would
We
be
are
worrying about
fine.
not
Yes,
collecting their
we are.
taxes. And then some other uncertainties here, but when you summed these up, and this was just probably sort of like almost a worst case scenario approach, that came out to 4.7 million of, what if these revenues go away? On top of that, then looking at different emergencies. So if there were an infrastructure failure, some major damage to roadways or something like that, I also would take that to be, to a building, something like that. Which I did find out that Village Hall actually burned down in 1996 when I was talking with Carlton, so I did not know that before. $1 million for natural disasters, and you'll see later that is, again, probably worst case scenario, very unlikely that we would have that amount of loss.
To Jeff's point, though, a tornado could do that. I don't think the other, winter storm, hurricane, but a tornado in theory.
Worst case scenario, tornado could
Wipe out,
It could dwarf that
yes,
figure.
yes,
Not an unrealistic number at all.
no.
At the Fair Barn some years ago,
Really? Do you remember how much it cost?
Dana, did you say earlier that sales tax revenues are around 13% of total revenue?
33%, they're about a third.
33.
Yeah, so the ad valorem taxes are about half, and the various sales tax revenues
So
in
they're
total
8
are about a
million.
third.
They're 8 million round numbers.
Yeah, a little
And
more.
therefore, the 2.4 million is then a 30% decline in sales tax revenues.
Yeah, I think this was about a 25% decline. Yeah.
Or a smaller percent spread over a longer period of time. You know, an
Yes.
Economic downturn wouldn't last just
Right.
1 year typically, so.
Yeah, this 2.4 million here at least was assuming 25% over 2 years. Yeah. And then again, so money for potential legal settlements, and then they came up with 1.7 million needed for emergency reserves. When you add those two together, you would need 6.4 million total, which was about 32% of budgeted expenditures. And I think this, the timing kind of correlated then with the change in 2020 to the 30% minimum policy. And I believe this may have been sort of part of the justification for that change. But I think this approach has some flaws. I think a major one being these are not necessarily all worst case scenario numbers, but they're all pretty bad case scenario numbers. They're not really taking into account the range of possibilities and the probability of different outcomes. And they're also assuming that everything is additive, that all of these could happen, that basically it's saying all of these are going to happen in one time span that we're
Right.
looking at. Also not likely, right?
The perfect storm very rarely happens. Right?
Yes. And so the GFOA has updated has a pretty robust amount of information and some very detailed reports you can read on other entities about this. So I did kind of a basic version of what they do in their consultant reports because they will do this kind of analysis for organizations. I did sort of a very basic version of that where I took some of the elements of what was considered before, like the extreme weather events, legal claims, kind of an major infrastructure or building damage or issue, and gathered data for what's the probability of different outcomes and different dollar, cost impacts over a 5-year period. And then did a Monte Carlo analysis, a simulation over 1,000 iterations to get sort of the statistical view of, I'm not a statistician, I did just fine in college and in high school, but it was not my major. But at least, to give some perspective of one way that we could look at this. I'm not saying this is the be-all, end-all, the answer, but it's one way of looking at it. And if we, running those scenarios, if we are comfortable with a 90% confidence level, meaning that in 900 out of 1,000 of the scenarios that were run, 90% of the time we would have enough funds in reserves to cover any of the possibilities that could happen in a 5-year period, these would be sort of the amount that we would need to have in reserves for that 90% confidence. If you do that basic summation, sorry, was there a question?
Another way to look at that is 1 time out of 10, we wouldn't have enough.
Correct. Yes. When you sum them all together, it comes up to $693,000. In total, though, you have to also then consider sort of that pooling of risk, that when we look at them in the aggregate, what are the odds of all of them happening within one 5-year time frame? When we pool them together, then to feel we have a 90% confidence that we can cover any combination that may happen in a 5-year period, we would need $572,000 in this one example.
This is net of insurance, but understanding that even if you're insured, there can be a time delay of,
This would not be, this would not be net of insurance, it would be what's the initial cost impact? What's the initial outlay we would have to make for repairs, et cetera? We may get reimbursed after the fact, but that may be down the road and it
Right.
would not be immediately available.
And it's also not assuming that we would immediately assess taxpayers a surcharge, right?
Exactly, and that's what we're trying to avoid, right? Is that we're trying to have some basis for what we maintain so that we don't have to assess taxpayers, by hiking the tax rate in the next year, or, doing some really significant, cost-cutting measures that can be detrimental. I know this is very technical, but again, it's just meant to illustrate one way that we can be looking at it. This is the distribution curve where it just really is illustrating that we've got the majority of it is high frequency, very low impact. It's this right tail end that you need to, that we're maybe not covered for. And the,
Statistically interesting that in 1,000 iterations, there were those two categories in the far right tail that you got none. If you did 10,000, that wouldn't
and
happen.
I could, it's just a little Excel add-in. And then
Looks like
this,
there's a market for local municipalities pooling together for insurance coverage on capital items. I assume there's no project in that from North Carolina that does that?
because we haven't, our insurance is through the NCLM risk management pool, Jeff, right?
And are we involved in that or not involved in that?
We are,
Okay, so,
yep.
okay, thank you.
Yep, and then this curve on the right is the curve showing us that kind of that confidence level. So at 90%, this here is where we're just under the $600,000 mark. And you see it really flattens out after that, meaning there's a point of diminishing returns, that it costs a lot to buy extra confidence that we'd be able to cover, you know, any adverse events that could happen.
I feel I'm prepared for all-out nuclear attack now. That we here in Pinehurst, we're covered. I do have, well, you have a couple more slides, don't you?
Yes, just
Okay.
a couple more. I'm sorry. I know this is a lot.
Thorough. I know my colleagues may find this weird. I really like this presentation.
And so finally, then, when we kind of put together the various pieces, if we go back to those four reasons that four purposes of reserves from the very beginning, the first was cash flow. And this, I just kind of kept as that kind of a catch-all of 3 months operating expenditures. That is sort of what that the November 2019 number worked out to. And it's still pretty consistent with using this method, what it worked out to. The best practices say to maintain 2 months of operating expenditures, and that is, you know, and this is really where we're covering those major revenue losses. And then if we layer in our, what we might want to have, say, is in reserves for emergencies and risks, that's from the previous slide. And then the opportunities, future capital, I didn't have a great basis for, but at least it's kind of some placeholders there. But again, to illustrate an example of how we could look at our fund balance and determining what level of a minimum would be appropriate. The future capital isn't a complete shot in the dark. If you look over a number of years at kind of roughly what ends up being taken from fund balance in the budget to fund capital that's in excess of what the revenues are for that year, it's not out of line with that. And then it also could ensure that we're kind of adding to as well. And then if we look at that sort of over time as a percentage of our budgeted expenditures, since that's the measure where we're kind of looking when we're projecting, you'll see the range is kind of from 25 to 28% as a percentage of actual expenditures, which is a lower amount. Then we're kind of in a 27 to 33 range. So our 30%, at least, you know, from this one way of looking at it, our 30% is probably a pretty reasonable number. Could it be lower? Yeah. But I think in terms of overall observations, you know, it could be lower. It wouldn't be out of line with our peers. I think we would still be following our very robust and mature planning process to where each year we're evaluating the budget and the 5-year forecast to ensure that we're planning responsibly, to provide that predictability, stability, and consistency and flexibility that we would want to have financially as an organization, so that we are not having to unexpectedly raise tax rates or something like that to make up for something. One other element I wanted to mention was just that if we, let's say we needed to dip into some of these reserves for something, our policy does state that if budgeted, not necessarily dipping into the reserves, we needed to actually go below our minimum for some reason. If there's, our policy does state that if some sort of emergency or unexpected need, causes us to go below a 5% change in budgeted revenues or expenditures, council can authorize going below the threshold as long as there is also a plan for replenishing that fund balance back up to the minimum in a reasonable amount of time. The GFOA guidance is 1 to 3 years. Our surpluses in good years typically are 1.2 million. So if we had to go below within, that's certainly a reasonable time frame, that between either, receiving that insurance or, FEMA reimbursement if it was some sort of natural disaster or property damage, or surpluses, we would be able to certainly manage getting back up to that threshold.
And on the last slide, the top, please remind me what goes into amounts unavailable for expenditure?
That is, let me go back to that slide real quick. If we go back to what we report in the audit. So it's not accounting for, these are relatively small.
I thought
the
they're pretty small
inventory
numbers.
prepaids where they're not in a spendable form, right? They're not a liquid asset or something that you could use to pay for something or sell quickly. And this stabilization by state statute is really the bigger one, where that's the funds that based on the LGC or the statutory calculation, we cannot spend those funds. It's primarily that we don't have them in cash.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
So I can't spend.
Yep, so this sort of almost represents, like, if I had to give it like a proxy, we have receivables at the end of a fiscal year, meaning it's funds that we are due, but we haven't received in cash yet. This is almost sort of saying, like, we haven't received them yet, you need to make sure you don't spend that money because you haven't gotten it yet.
Oh, when you're going back, go back a few more slides.
Down.
I had two, no, the other way.
Oh, sorry.
There were two, no, there was the one where you had a chart where it showed the fund balance policy changing over the years.
Oh, yep. This
Yeah,
one.
maybe that's it. No, I think that is it. It went from 27 to 33 in 2005.
Yep.
Then we went from 30 to 40, and that stayed in place until 21?
Yes,
Okay.
Yep.
So that's when it went from 30 to 40 to a minimum of 30.
yes.
But what is that one below it? Added policy, the commitment of fund balance in excess of 40. Oh, that's the in excess.
Yeah,
check.
so
Okay.
that's where it's like, we, in a way, almost still kind of have that range where we're trying to, but we're saying anything outside of that range, anything above and beyond that range, we're doing.
That's kind of my, I have.
So, to put this in perspective here, these were policy discussions and decisions made, but the reality is the fund balance has stayed somewhere in the neighborhood of, at a minimum, 35, 40% throughout the entire history here. I mean, that's at a minimum.
Yes,
So these were somewhat academic exercises, not that it's unuseful, but, the decision between this range and 30% and 30 to 40 and so forth and so on, it depended upon the council members at that time and what they felt was appropriate or not appropriate. But we've always had a very healthy, luckily, fund balance and been able to weather the storms and/or fund the capital improvements as necessary.
The other question had to do with GFOA. I thought I read that their policy recommendation is a 25%, their best practice.
I don't think they have a
I'm not-
specific
I'm not-
percentage.
They don't use anymore.
The LGC, yeah, the
I must have
LGC, I
read
did share that document just to give some background and clear up, because the LGC put out the one about, with the myths of the 8%
Oh, I
and
remember
such.
the LGC, the
Yes.
myth- the 8%.
I
myth,
don't
yes.
think the
I read.
GFOA recommendation specifies a percentage. Usually they shy away from,
I think he's
Giving-
referencing the LGC.
Okay. I wasn't, no, I thought I read it somewhere else, under,
Yeah.
when I went to, going on the GFOA website, and it had a best practices of 25%. I'm not, you don't have to look for it now.
Yeah,
but
I
I'll
have it
try to
here.
find where I had it in my notes.
Yeah.
Dana, you and I talked about that last week when we were looking at the previous version of this, and I brought up the same point, that there was that historical reference to something that said that, I think it was towns, population range of 10,000 to 50,000. In that range, the minimum should be 25%.
Yeah, that must have been what I read.
Oh, yes, correct. Yes, thank you. Yeah, so the LGC did change the way that they kind of, the guidance that they give. I shouldn't say the way they report out, because they are still reporting all the data, and that's where the benchmarks and, you know, the averages and medians within your peer group come from. But they used to provide a report at the end of each fiscal year, giving a minimum recommendation for each peer group. They no longer do that, and now are kind of following similar guidance to GFOA, where it's much broader, and it is more, you need to think about what's appropriate for your entity. Here's maybe some very minimum guidelines, but
I just
they
read it
definitely they've gotten away from giving any minimum percentage guidelines.
Well, this is, look, I actually enjoyed this. I'm impressed with it. And it filled in, again, some blanks. I do think it's something we ought to consider as we go through the budget process as to whether or not we just adjust it slightly. I would, you know, that's.
So
that's my thoughts.
definitely fund balance 401, not 101.
Yeah, this is senior level. You're about
Thank
to
you.
graduate.
Appreciate
Yes, no, it's very helpful.
Dana, great,
There'll be a test at your next meeting.
Yes.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Excellent,
Are
really.
there any, if you think of anything, I know it was a lot of information, but if there are kind of any unanswered questions or anything else that I can prepare for you, please let me know. Especially in advance of the budget work sessions and things
Right.
that will be coming up in
Important,
May.
yep.
I thought
Which
this was
you'll get plenty of
remarkably
materials in.
comprehensive and reminded me in some ways of sort of the risk management that major Wall Street firms take when they're running proprietary books and thinking about extraordinary events and what could really trip you up and maybe threaten the viability of the organization. So
Right.
Uh,
Thank you.
When we are looking at the 5-year financial forecast spreadsheet, I guess the numbers that we're seeing now, or the formatting of the numbers, we'll see those like that. on the spreadsheet.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank
Appreciate it.
you.
3-minute break.
3-minute break. are back, and we are on our final item, discussion of the village manager recruitment process. Angie Cantor, a veteran of this process, so
What?
please begin.
So what I've outlined for you is the process we used about 10 years ago. So Jeff is going to be leaving his position in October. Gives us about 8 months to find somebody to fill his shoes. And I thought I would just outline the process that we used 10 years ago when Andy retired. Not complicated, very simple. We did do this in-house. So one of the first things we did after deciding to do the process in-house, we prepared a candidate profile. We actually used Ellis Hankins. He had worked with the League of Municipalities, and he came in and he took all the department heads into a meeting, and we all said, this is what we want, or this is what we'd like to see. He also met with council, and from that, he compiled a profile for us, which we posted on the applicant brochure, which I think all of you got a copy of. We then posted the vacancy using that brochure. As the applications came in, I reviewed those. The former manager reviewed those. We narrowed that field down. Once we had the field narrowed, then we sent out, I would call a phase 2 questionnaire, if you will. And from that, we narrowed the field down again. But council was able to see those questionnaires, and they actually narrowed that field down to the final folks who would come in for interviews. Andy and I helped prepare questions. We also used the League of Municipalities to help us prepare questions to ask the candidates. Council was the only one involved in the interview. Interviewed 3 candidates, selected one, extended an offer, and 7 months later, Jeff Sanborn started. So he really threw my numbers off that year, I'll just tell you. That was kind of our process in a nutshell. You do have several options. You can do this process in-house again. You have the option of using a consulting service, which a lot of places do when they're hiring for the village manager. Most of the time, those folks will do a full-blown assessment center type of process. The applications will flow through them. They'll narrow the field down, and then they'll get you involved once the assessments start.
I'm not a fan of that process.
Yeah,
Wouldn't be
that
involved.
process is not a cheap process. You just got through talking with the financials with Dana. Yeah, you could use some of that fund balance for that.
Right.
It usually will run anywhere from $25,000 to $30,000.
Right. We don't need that.
In this process, between, step 3, 4, and 5, I mean, what is the percentage? Let's say you had 100 to start with. I don't know what the number was. And then the narrowed field from step 3 to step 4 was what?
If I recall correctly, we had anywhere between 80 and 100. I've
But
seen
yeah,
a-
you started high.
right.
okay.
I've seen a lot of applications since then in the last 10 years.
It
But
was
we,
like 50% got a supplemental questionnaire, or 30%, or 10%?
it was about 20 people.
So 20 out of, say 20%, this is a round
Yeah,
number.
we narrowed it pretty good. And then it might have been 15 to 20. And then we sent out a separate questionnaire. I think there were about 6 or 7 questions. I still have the questionnaire. And the candidates completed that. And then from that process, council then received those responses and narrowed that field down.
Selected it for the interviewees.
Right. How they did it, which made perfect sense. It was very simple. All of you got to see all of the applications, and you listed your top 3 to 8. And then we went in closed session, and we wrote the candidates' names down and how many candidates. So you maybe had, we listed yours, and then out of your list, you had 3 of those, you had 2 of those. So we did it like that, and it ended up being three candidates that were interviewed.
And I'm assuming some of that was Kentucky windage and the idea that if you ended up having, hey, let's say 5, that the council would rather have interviewed. It was, okay, 5 is fine, you do that.
Absolutely.
And so just like you're going through this, and I appreciate what you're saying, Jack, about the percentages, but I think a lot of this is going to be dictated by what we receive. You know, what sort of applications, how many applications, and as we're narrowing it down, and then if you see 15 that are awesome, you know, then you end up interviewing 15, you know, it just, do we have to do?
Names, but the initial cut's easy.
Initial cut is usually
Get a whole
pretty
bunch of
easy.
Applicants that really
Yeah.
don't have any,
Push the send button.
don't meet any of the minimum standards.
Right, right.
The vacancy, I'll call it a vacancy announcement when we post it. I'm trying to look at the calendar. If we are, is it realistic that 30 days from now, we may be able to have a vacancy announcement up?
30 days from now? Sure.
Okay.
Right.
So let's work from that date of April 15th.
I actually left the calendar, I apologize, I had actually already done that, and I left the calendar on my desk.
right.
Typically, we post the job anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks.
I think that's too long.
Too
I think,
short, you mean?
I think 4 weeks is enough.
You're saying how long it's going to be posted?
Posted for the public to apply.
Might consider 6.
30 days.
Oh, but if,
Why would that be short?
I
Well, we
would
could
say a
have the-
minimum of 6.
we could have the experience the SMPO is having.
4. Jeff's job was 4.
Yeah, I would, the reason I say that is I think, obviously, this is probably will be a sought-after job. Last time you had somewhere between, depending on our memories, 80 to 100.
Something like that.
And technology has moved on since then. It's very much easier to apply now.
Can always extend it if we need
And
to.
if you're not happy with the amounts of applications, you just extend it. I mean, 30 days is usually the standard for senior executive
Not,
positions.
not for a manager job.
And for the
typically
well, I'm
not.
just saying the
Yeah.
executive branch of the federal government, 30 days was what you would put out for a senior executive. That's what we did.
There's also a lot of internal hiring from that.
Yeah, well, it could be internal hiring. It's for everybody. 30 days.
So, if you post, let's say you post in April, I had actually put it on a 6-day window. So I'm going to promise you, you're not going to interview in June. You've got a little golf tournament coming here. You're not going to have time.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine.
Second half maybe, not first half.
Yeah, not the first 2
Yeah,
weeks.
yeah. And so you're probably looking at interviewing somewhere, I had pegged it more closer to August, July or August, because I had it being posted longer.
Yeah.
And then coordinating 5 calendars plus your candidate
Sure.
is usually.
Which is why I'd like to have more, I'd like to move it back this way because we have to coordinate a lot of calendars, including the candidate.
Sure, absolutely.
Cast a wide net, to try to find the best candidate. And as part of the wide net, it has to do with how much time, the position is posted. I mean, it doesn't have to be 6 months or not,
Oh, no.
3 months even, but
Let me ask you a couple of questions. Is North Carolina League of Municipalities, will they be a big promoter of the advertisement? Do they have a board where people who want to work for village government apply?
Yes, we will post to the League of Municipalities, but that is not the only place we'll post.
Oh, absolutely not. We should
Sure. Right.
post it widely.
Right.
Which is why I think we will get plenty of applications.
Personal perspective, that's not a site I look at very often.
No.
And, a lot of other folks out there probably aren't looking at that site very often either, and same thing with the county commissioner's site, which is another popular place.
Right.
A lot of us, we have our head down and we're just trying to do good things for where we're working, and I think I think I would recommend leaving it open as long as the hiring window allows for, In other words, if you got 7 or 8 months until I leave, take advantage of that time.
I got to say with you on this, Jack. I agree. I think longer on there. We got the time to do it. We got the U.S. Open coming. The downside of closing it early.
I want to agree. What's the consensus? How long do we want to have it up?
I could live with 60 days, 2 months, or whatever the.
60 days, it's fine with me. I'm just
60 days. That's
I don't want to get caught up on the time thing.
Is that reasonable?
I think that's reasonable.
Okay. All right, I would like to make one other request. I want the initial applications, now it'll be up 60 days. I would like to see, in addition to yourself and the village manager, one member of the council be part of that process from day one. I don't know how other members feel here, but I'd like to see just, what,
In step 3, as you're talking about here, if we're looking at this,
review the initial applications.
Yes.
So I will tell you, the last time I made 5 binders, and council was able to see all applications, and the binders were about yay thick,
With the recommendation that
with the recommendations, right, right,
go back through and say, no,
absolutely,
add this person or take that person out.
absolutely. If you, be careful what I ask, be careful what you ask for, is all I say.
Well, it sounds like then that we'll all be involved in that
Yeah,
process.
I
Correct.
actually like that. I'm worried about one person doing it, but I think for the binders being there and everybody can look at it, I like that.
Sold. I'm convinced. Okay, next, what's the next issue? So we got 60 days, and we're all going to get a shot at looking at every application.
if you choose and you're available, is that a criteria? You're not counting that as a step that has to go through, we have to go through it in order to move to the next stage, is that correct? Or am I misunderstanding that?
My understanding is you're getting 5 binders,
That's right.
and if you want to read them, you can. If you don't, you don't have to.
You're-
But I'm reading mine.
You'll get 5 binders that'll be,
And I'm counting on him reading his.
5 binders
And
that'll
one day to
be
read them.
narrowed down already, but you'll get everybody, but in the beginning of the binder, you'll have the narrowed down candidates.
And you were expecting everyone to give you a narrowed list then, each of the 5 council members?
At some point, yes.
You're going to give a narrowed list to us.
We're
what
going to give you a
recommendations-
recommended narrowed list, and you can tell us
Recommended list,
changes
yeah.
you'd like to see.
Yeah.
Could add people back in from the non-narrowed
See
list
them
if we
all.
wanted to.
We'll get a narrowed down list, and then from that narrowed down list, we'll.
Not going to
narrow
get
it
stage
down again.
1 raw data, right? Is that
When we get into closed session, then add or subtract however you want and discuss it and say, hey, this person's a golfer, this one's not, whatever's important.
So
to
we
you.
will not get these weekly. We'll have to wait until the application period is closed.
Yes.
And we'll get 1 binder.
I would suggest waiting until
Yes,
it's
we should wait,
closed.
otherwise it gets,
Hard to maintain
It
a
is.
consistent viewpoint on things
Yeah.
I
over
agree.
time like that.
It's hard to read 100 all at once, but
Yeah.
I think I agree.
Can be done.
What percent of them get washed out at the very beginning, roughly?
Well, we narrowed it down to 15 to 20 right out of the gate, so, yeah.
85% last time.
And Jeff, your experience with SMPO, not necessarily directly related, but you're finding it not that difficult to think probably no chance versus we ought to think about this person.
Much broader than SMPO. That's just one hiring action, but
that's not comparable.
that one's really easy. There's only one candidate that's probably might be qualified.
Well, we would certainly expect more than that, but you're saying that your ability to cut that is, you can get to that pretty quickly. To
Yeah,
whether
I
it's
think
25 or
yeah,
20.
it is a lot of reading, but the folks that are genuinely qualified are pretty easy to pick out.
I think they rise to, the cream rises fairly
Very
quickly.
easily.
Yeah.
Very easily. And then we can help with questions. The league will also help with questions. The COG can help with questions. There are questions everywhere that we can
But
formulate.
when we're interviewing candidates, I assume that will be a closed session.
The 5 of you will interview. It will be closed session. Keep in mind, this is a very confidential process.
Right.
So the
wanna be
names
sure.
cannot be released. But you would interview, the 5 of you would interview each candidate. Usually, last time we did it off-site. I rented a conference room at the Holly, just to kind of protect.
Good idea.
Well, we want to protect the applicant as
Protect
much
the
as-
applicant, that's correct.
Good idea.
And then when I think, Jeff, you'll have to help me with this, but with each candidate, after the interview process, it was a good half day. It was a good 4 or 5 hours. A couple of the council members actually took each candidate after their respective
dinner,
interviews to dinner. Right.
I think it's important, I appreciate fully the closed process a lot of this is, but it's very important that we message this to the public as to what the process is.
Yeah.
And so to inform them, yes, it's it's a, private type of thing that's going on, but ultimately this is what we're looking at. Certainly the documents that you provided, which I think are excellent, just update the few things that are on there, but to include, and I think we talked about this, the candidate profile, outside consultant before. We don't need an outside consultant. The current candidate profile, I think, is fine from my perspective. Yeah, that there's no additions that are needed to that. But my point is, as we determine this, and you don't have to give a specific date, but say phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, in and around these dates that this type of thing will occur, to give the public an understanding as to what's happening, and then also informing them this is not something that can be done out in the open for that, because there will be questions on that.
That together for you to look at. I took a look at it. I passed it to Jeff to take a look at. And then if there's anything on there that you think maybe needs to be modified. I don't think the functions of the role have changed.
But I agree with that, but I would be interested, Jeff, in your thoughts as to things that you might want to change or update, because it's 2024,
That's a
not
good idea.
2014.
I did review it,
Good
and
idea.
I didn't see anything that jumped off the page. Maybe some recognition of our new role in the SMPO could add that in there, but
And the only thing that on timing, I want to work backwards a little bit. If we have October 25th, and if a successful candidate has 60-day obligation to their current employer, that means we're at August 25th.
Well, if-
If we don't close until, what do we say, 60 days is going to be May 15th? No, we're not posting April 15th, we're closing June 15th.
15th. And you're reviewing candidates
Is
for a
that-
couple of
is
weeks,
that-
and you're
and
talking
what-
about July before you can really start the narrowing down process.
And July and August are going to be harder to, I mean, I'm not entirely sympathetic to someone who's applying for a job that says, hey, I'm on vacation. They're going to have to make a choice there,
Yeah.
but is that enough time? That's my
Yeah.
question.
And I don't know to what degree the provisions in my contract are common to other folks out there, but I have a 6-month notice requirement.
Thought that was a 60-day.
60 day,
It was 60 days, but
60 day. You said 6 month, you meant 60 days.
60 days.
I think mine's 6 months.
Huh? No,
Yeah.
yeah.
Contract that I read, but okay.
There's a resolution already.
You're not trying to change your departure date, are you?
No.
I think it's plenty, I think it's plenty of time. So even if somebody said, okay, I've got to give a 30-day notice, let's say you hire an external candidate and they say I have to give a 30-day notice, and maybe they're from Oregon and they have to move here as well. So you do need to keep that in mind. But if it is after he leaves, you would have to appoint an interim.
Am I correct that the last time we went through this, there was actually a 7-month gap between the time Andy Wilkerson left and the time Jeff started?
Correct, because Jeff had to finish.
Thank you, Jeff.
I was going to say, was that contract negotiation or because separation from the military and so forth?
Yeah, it was. We were actually, we extended the offer to him in October. I think it was. Andy was leaving in November. And we extended the offer in October. Andy left, and Jeff Batten took the helm on December 1st.
So there's a precedent for having a gap if we need to, and maybe
Yeah.
good to avoid as much gap as possible. So,
Just when he thinks he's out, we might pull him back in. You know?
Yeah. No, I included those because Patrick requested. Yeah. Yeah. Did those have the names? Did they have the names on them?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
very good, thank you.
Sure. Oh, yes, but it is all public record, so it's all good.
That's right. Okay, so we're going to have a 60 days advertisement. We will all see all applications. There'll be a narrowing of the list, a first culling, we'll get that first culling along with all the applications. We'll eventually set up interviews off-site for all members of the council and whoever those final people are we interview. It could be 5, it could be 10, we don't know until we sort of really get a look at what the applications are like. We have agreed to a vacancy announcement, more or less, and I think we wanted to review, take one more look at the sort of position description in case there's a few things that need to be edited there. So if anyone has any suggestions, we should supply them to Angie.
And you'll supply us with the final draft or whatever you want to call it. It's probably the same or similar, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. If we make any changes to the job description, if we add the MPO information, I'll give you that as well as a draft of the brochure.
Okay, great.
And how will the brochure be utilized?
Well,
Say brochure.
it will be this type of document. It will be electronic.
Okay.
Yeah, if someone wants to print it out, they can.
Are we accepting applications other than electronic?
No.
Thank you. I'm just trying to speed up the process.
If you
I
want, if
remember
you
the
want
paper
me to
ways.
do the recruiting, no.
I think that the test in itself,
Good, yeah, I mean, good question. I recall that the essay questions that we submitted, that's that 20 or so folks, but I
Right.
think those were just emailed to you, weren't they?
They were. So when we after the first swipe, the folks we sent the questionnaires to, we gave them instructions. They had about, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 questions, maybe 10. And you were limited to so many words, so you were limited to a page response for each question. And that was just an electronic exchange. So we emailed it to you, and then they emailed it back. So.
Can't tell you how helpful it is to have this process. And you, having gone through it before, really, it's super helpful.
Other thoughts?
I like this.
Okay, sounds like we have a plan.
Yep.
Okay, well, I guess you'll want to hear from us on a few things, and then you ask us what else you need.
Right, so we'll plan for 60 days, just to repeat. I'll get a timeline of the process available, so that can be communicated to the public. We could talk about what format that needs to be, if it needs to be in a regular meeting or what,
I think we should probably
Whatever.
post on our website.
we can do
Okay,
that.
exactly what we're going to do, and we can also verbalize it in a
Just to be clear,
future council meeting.
announcement is in 30 days, but then a 60-day window after that.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
I think it's worthwhile having Angie present this in a regular council meeting and just say, this is the timeline, this is what we're doing, and that, as well as posting online.
But why don't we do that the next
Get on the
meeting?
9th of April? And come back to you with the, is that?
That
next
sounds
meeting?
reasonable to
no,
me.
We have one more for that, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
The
that's fine.
26th, yeah.
Either do it on the 26th or.
If you can do it the 26th, let's do it.
Yeah.
Because the 9th would still proceed when you're going to post the job.
Yeah, either would work, but the 26th, I think, would be better if it's possible.
But we cannot over-communicate this.
No, of course not.
I'll start working on the brochure. I can't promise that we'll have that ready by the 26th, but
If nothing else, a timeline type of stuff.
Yeah.
To discuss the
Okay.
the
yeah,
timeline
but
and
I'm trying to
process.
think if we can have it ready, we might
can-
be able to go ahead and post, but we've got budget meetings all next week,
Yeah,
so.
right.
Overview of the process, and the publicity is what we're looking
Yes.
for, is that right?
Yeah, exactly. The purpose of this is to set expectations for our constituents, okay? If we also recruit people, that's great. But my purpose on asking for this is to make sure our folks know what's happening here.
To do now, yeah, well,
Sure.
here's what we're going to do.
Right.
Got it.
And I'd like to probably, I think it's fair to say that we want to pick a date when we hope to have somebody in the job. Since we know when the incumbent is departing, I think it's fair to maybe pick a date of November 1 or something that that's our target. So let's think about that.
Sure.
Okay? Because once you look at the calendar, rather than have this open-ended, because that's a question you'll ask, get asked, and
And
I
it,
will.
and it may really depend on the candidate.
Yeah,
Would
sure.
would our target be to have any overlap, to have them hypothetically on board October
I
10th?
was gonna ask that,
October 15th?
Do you all call that left seat, right seat? Okay, sorry, that's a military term, but
No, but
basically you have an overlap there for a
best
period
seat
of
in the
time.
airplane's front left, but you usually sit front right for a while first, so.
That's kind of the point.
Yeah.
Left seat, right seat, and so the right seat there.
That's because that, again,
We
I don't want
have,
to say it backs us up, but it,
An overlap would be a luxury.
It'd be wonderful if
Yeah,
there
nice to
I
have.
mean,
we
I
have
can,
done
I can tell you,
that.
I came here with actually zero actual local government experience. But when I got here, that first week, our wonderful staff had me lined up with onboarding, department by department, issue by issue. And I felt like I was able to kind of hit the ground running. I don't know that we necessarily have to have a left seat, right seat. We have a very capable staff that can bring a new manager on board and
Good at onboarding, I can tell you that. That's
Eh,
for sure.
I think it'd be a luxury.
Yeah.
I don't see a criticality of it.
Right.
just
It-
a question.
Yeah, it has happened in some other positions that we've had, and I guess we're certainly open to it.
Yeah.
But no guarantees it could happen.
it might be helpful to, once you make a hiring decision, have a conversation with the person and see what they're comfortable with too, so.
Okay. Anything else you need from us, Angie? Anything else, council? Nope, okay. I'll entertain a motion.
I move to adjourn the work session.
But if I could, before we have a second.
All right, we don't have a second.
First is a question.
Where's my second?
Which is, I have in my packet a suggested motion to go into closed session. Do we not need that for any
No.
purpose?
No.
Good, happy to file.
Unless you want to.
Yeah, I want to put this out because I think it could be very important. We don't have the library anywhere on our agenda tonight, but I had kind of what I'll call a crazy idea that I visited with Doug on. And Doug came back with actually, let me take a step back. In the meeting in which we requested a plan for 8,400 square feet, Jeff, you made the question to Doug, is it within our scope of work?
Yeah.
Have we effectively exhausted the funds for which we hired the consultant?
Yep.
So I sat down with Doug to see, because I didn't understand what the contract was, and I don't want anyone to work for us for free. We're going to make a multi-million-dollar decision here, and if we have to spend another $10,000 with a consultant, we should.
Yeah.
No question. As an outcome from that conversation, I proposed a crazy idea, which was, in order to avoid entanglements with the National Park Service, could we investigate building a two-story building on the existing footprint, so we're not expanding anywhere? And we kicked that around a little bit informally. Doug even gave me a cost estimate, which I did not find particularly interesting. But I think he came back also with another number, and with permission, it was a 12,000 square foot on the Village Green, at a cost number that I find extremely interesting. Now, I don't expect, that isn't the bid that we would go out with. It may not be the right number, but you have enough, I don't think you're off dramatically, put it that way. I have enough respect for both your history doing this. If we are going to, we didn't get the 8,400 square foot plan, but even that, I'm sorry, the 8,400 square foot plan on Magnolia Road is X, 5.5 to 6. And we have another 1.4 to 2.3 for the archives, so we're now talking $7.5, $8 million. This number was $5.1 million. I find that an extremely interesting number because that's all in. That's archives and library and 12,000 square feet on the green.
Can
I just,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
if I could, I'm going to distribute around. I made 6 copies of this. Doug, I can give you one later if you don't have one.
Fine.
You all have received a series of emails. They came in 2 batches. One was sort of in the early part of February, and I think that came out of a reasonably well-organized group that asked Barb Ficklin and I to sit down with them. And the second, more recently in March, came as a result of, I believe, both a posting on Nextdoor and the op-ed, or the editorial piece in the Pilot. But you can see here that, not statistically significant, a tremendous number of people who have voiced an opinion say, please leave it on the green. And on my own copy, I even added Mr. Schreiber down at the bottom, which I put him in the column of expand somewhere. And the third thing we have is the $4.5 million that is currently in the budget, against which we're going to spend something north of that. Nobody knows what yet. I find, and the final piece is, we have in Jack Farrell someone who is not only our designated representative to speak to the National Park Service, but also someone who has institutional knowledge of the library and the archives that probably is unequaled by anybody here. And so we don't have to make any decisions, but to me, for a decision that we're going to have to make, the possibility of expanding on the green in line with these people's opinions and doing it in consultation with the Park Service. In the presentation they made a year ago, February, said, here are the 4 criteria under which we would allow expansion of the 2 existing buildings, the chapel and the library. I found that interesting. I wanted to raise it with all of you because it was kind of an informal conversation with Doug. But I find it, if $5.1 million were the number for 12,000 square feet on the green, I would find that a hugely interesting number. It does not answer parking. I admit that right up front. I'm also coming out of a conversation I had with someone else that, you know, when we think about what is the new library going to be, there's going to be research space. When we think about the archives, we want research space. We don't necessarily need segregated research space. We need quiet spaces for people to do research, whether they're researching a topic related to the archives or not. So maybe 12,000 square feet, and I'm not dividing it up. How much is dedicated archives? How much is dedicated library? I don't know. Maybe that's enough. But I did want to surface this conversation with all of you, and you can all take it from, postpone it to another conversation, or take it forever, however you want.
Can I make a couple observations?
Absolutely.
Ask a question. Are you talking about expanding the existing building or
Yes.
raising it and building a new structure?
To be determined. I don't believe the cost of demolition would be that great, and that might be an option, but the important point is you'd have to get some consultation with the Park Service to add 50% to that existing building, which is not an immaterial expansion, although as I read their comments from February 6, 7, whatever those dates were, they're not categorically opposed to that, conditioned on the 4 criteria they listed.
Just real quick, tearing down and rebuilding would be vastly more expensive.
Would be another 300,000, maybe, something like that.
Well,
Well,
because the
I'm sorry.
renovation
Talking
of
about
the-
building a
the-
12,000 square foot building.
Right, no, if you're talking about new foundation, what have you, yes. So I think the answer is no. Adding on.
Yeah, so there's 2 things jump off the page at me on that idea. One is, we still have the parking problem to solve.
Yep.
The more significant is, I'm pretty sure that at least a couple of years ago, probably more than that, we did an engineering analysis on the building, and we learned that the foundation will not support a second story.
I understand. I'm taking that off. That was a wild idea, but I'm taking that off the table. I believe Doug's proposal is 12,000 on 1 floor.
Right, well, and that was just a number that was thrown out because that might potentially be within the area that the National Park Service would be willing to let us build.
Right. And I think you,
Where do we get this idea of where the Park Service would allow us to build?
Yeah, right, that's just a number. It's,
Right.
it's not, and that's not dividing, we don't know how much we want for the archives, we don't know how much we want for the libraries. That was just, if it was going to be that big, that's roughly how much it would cost.
All right.
and I think that if I did kind of, it was a combination of the cost per square foot in the renovation plus cost per square foot for whatever the new construction, so 4,000 square feet at 475, and 8,000 square feet at 170, something like that.
I think we're probably underestimating the impact that doing that would have on our landmark.
That is why we don't put the shovel in the ground tomorrow. We talk to the Park Service first.
So the other
100%, I'm not, that is not a risk I want to take.
Yeah.
But they invited us to consult with them, so let's consult with them. And if they tell us we're crazy, okay, well. By the way, I would not stop the consultant from doing the 8,400 square feet because we may come back to that.
And
go
then
down
how do
and
we
go
solve
down.
the parking problem?
Pardon me?
Well, there's another issue too, and that's the expansion of the library. Because if
You
you,
couldn't expand it, yeah.
yeah, where
Yeah.
you start at 12,000 square feet, you're going to end there.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So that's my only point.
And we do intend on coming back at the next meeting with the 8,400 square foot discussion.
Jack, did you have anything you want?
Well, we were talking about potentially 3 functions here. I mean, we're talking about the library and the archives, and then at least a couple others. We were talking about potentially having a museum that would be of use to the community, and then maybe a welcome center. So there's 3 or 4 different functions that, at least 3 functions that would need to be consolidated into that building, and so.
Well, 2 for sure. The Welcome Center, maybe, maybe not, but the other 2, absolutely.
Welcome center's this much.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
not-
that's
yeah,
tiny,
it's-
but yeah.
The archives, well, it's what it is now. I mean, what I've heard is it's, what we have now is the archives in the library. And what's being suggested is that perhaps the National Park Service wouldn't object to us expanding 4,000 square feet in that footprint, which would then double the size of both the archives, probably both the archives and the library, but having some, as you've said it, shared space so that it would be easier to manage and so on and so forth.
I wouldn't want to change the style, which was one of their criteria. I think most people think that's a very attractive building. I agree with that, for whatever it's worth. Whether we could, in terms of expansion, whether we could architect it so that maybe a second story could be added, which the current building never envisioned and I don't think would support. These are all, and just with respect to parking,
You're never going to get past the parking situation, no,
well,
that I know of.
except
That's
without pretending that I know the answer, I would hope that this council in the course of the next 2 or 3 years would do something. Whether it goes back to the proposal that was on the plans a couple of years ago. We have downtown businesses who say we need more parking. We're going to lose a few spaces in this, the white old bank building that's now being privately occupied. Again, I don't pretend to know what the answer is, but I would hope that in the next 1.5 to 2 or 2.5 years, we come up with some decision on that. We have the money to
Well-
do something, I don't know how much.
Well, I think the obvious place to look is whatever we end up doing in Village Place. And how, I mean, that is truly land we own, and that we have some plans to have it redeveloped, and it's a logical place for parking. But after you leave that land,
like 2.5 blocks away.
yeah, well, we're a very healthy community. Once you leave there, you're dealing with other people's land.
Yeah.
Not ours.
No, I
And
understand.
that is a big hill to climb.
Patrick knows that's where we ran into
Yeah,
the
and parking
roadblock with the
and
carriage house.
parking,
Yeah.
as you know, is not a revenue producer for people with private land. But
Assuming
anyway,
hypothetically that we build Doug's Library, which I have no doubt is going to be spectacular, is that going to change the 60% of the people who say they never use the library? They're not going to be the source of demand. It's going to be the 40% who use it, who, because we are able to offer more programs and make it more attractive, that is what is going to be the source of the increase in demand for parking. I don't mitigate that issue at all. Nor do I have a particular solution other than I think it's something we're going to have, 4 years from now, if we've done nothing on parking, maybe there's nothing to be done. Hopefully, whether it's Village Place or somewhere. Look, everybody doesn't get to park right in front of the store they're going to in any town in the United States. right? You talk to people in Manhattan, you can't even get a taxi to pull up in front of
Yeah,
the place you
this
want to
is-
get out necessarily. So we may have a public education
yeah.
to do, but I think we're going to need to do something. We can't be
Well,
here 4
let's-
years from now and do
let-
nothing on parking.
Well, let's come back from the parking. You made an initial suggestion. What's involved in finding out, one, about the National Park Service's
I mean,
perception?
I'd be happy to explore that, but I think we're overstating the National Park Service's role in defining what we do to some extent. I really do.
Okay.
And I respect the landmark as much as anyone, although we haven't, quite honestly, in the last, since 1996, done anything about it. We haven't capitalized on it, other than during election time when it's a big topic. So it's worth talking to them about it. And by the way, there's been plans to greatly expand the library, like in 2013, the Great Expectations campaign had that thing going out, all blowing it all the way out to the edge. I mean, the edge of the second parcel that was allocated. So it's not unusual to see that design. And the design was attractive. Whether it would pass muster as far as them yanking our landmark status or not, I'm not quite sure. But it would be not welcome by the Park Service, but they would probably could live
I'm
with
not
it, in my
advocating that
opinion.
we take a big risk there. I'm advocating that we ask some questions and see where we stand.
Okay,
What
While
kind-
not slowing
what kind
down
of-
the other process.
Kind of facility do we want for the community? Through the last X number of years that we've been poking at this thing here, and we've gotten responses as to the type of programs and the interest they have in a facility and how they would use it. And so whether it can be done inside that expanded facility, I'm not quite sure, to be honest with you.
I would just add two other comments, and these came from a neighbor that I hadn't thought of. She has two of her children are now in college, one's still at Pinecrest. The two that were in college went to O'Neill. And she talked about the fact, and I would combine this with work from home, which no one was talking about before 3 years ago. When students today are working on a communal project, and my answer was, well, you go to somebody's house, you get the 3 or 4 of you together. And she said, no, you don't understand. There are parents who don't want other children in their house unless they've known these kids for years. Combination of whatever, think about vaccines or COVID or what have you. They go to the library, or they try to find a space like that. There are people who don't have a dedicated workspace in their house, and the dog is barking, and they want to do a conference call of some importance. They would like to have a dedicated space in a building like a library. I had not thought about those things. Maybe other people
Well,
had.
that's why the design, as I recall, tried to incorporate that type of
Yes.
activity to the best.
But again, that's what I consider to be shared space. That's communal space, because the community has demand for it, and I don't need to parse which segment of the community cares. I hadn't thought about that.
Let me ask, we heard from what sort of Jack's part in the answer to your question. I want to hear from Doug
Yeah,
as to
so-
what you think could be expected from our consultant, our architect, and both from a standpoint of time and price.
And make me clear, I'm not holding you to the number, only it was an interesting number that requires refinement.
Right. So first of all, I'd say I think we should stay on our current track of looking at the 8,400 square foot, and I think we all agree on that. I think if we wanted to go to the Park Service, we're going to need to show them something, and so there need to be some sort of layout of what that might potentially be. To do that, we're not necessarily starting over, but we're going to have to pay. We're going to have to draw something. We're going to have to decide how big does it really need to be? Is it 12,000? Is it 14,000? Whatever. That will cost money. It's not, so our contract with them right now is like 114,000. It won't cost all of that, but.
I thought it was 140.
Maybe it's 140.
Okay.
but,
You know,
it'll be.
Dana's trained me on numbers,
Down
so
to
I
tag ends
remember
left.
these.
We've,
Yeah,
we've
yeah.
spent most of the 140.
Yes, for them to go from, to potentially draw it down to the 8,400 square feet, I had to beg and plead. But I would think it's several tens of thousands of dollars to have them lay out something for.
Well, can you well, then why don't you ask them, what would be a sketch, whatever it is, the minimum that has something that is along the lines of these? And if it's a wild number, come back and let us know.
Good. Then they're gonna have to reprogram everything that we've talked about already. It's like, okay, well,
How are we going to solve the parking problem? Well, you're
Why-
going to have to
I guess
put multiple functions
Realistically,
in
why
one
are
building.
why do we want to go through this exercise and spend this money?
Well, I don't have an answer, Jeff, but my quasi retort is, how are we going to justify spending $8 million or whatever the number turns out to be instead of 4.5? We have a problem either way. We can pick which problem we prefer. But if the four of you think I'm crazy and we shouldn't pursue this, I'm fine with that, but I did not feel comfortable not raising the conversation.
I don't think
so we can make
financially
a
you're
decision.
crazy, because quite honestly, with two facilities, we're going to have, a little bit extra staff and a little extra expenses. And I think that's all kind of been baked in a little bit in our thinking. The question to me is, would one building serve a purpose to satisfy all the program requirements we talk about, plus the archives? And we'd have to give up the idea of even having a welcome center or a museum or anything like that associated with it. So I'm
I
not
guess
sure one building, that building in particular, would satisfy those requirements.
Jack, those are excellent questions. The one thing that, as I thought back to I think it's February 14th council meeting last year, the week after you heard the National Park Service made its presentation. And I did watch all of that, and it's, the segment on the library starts 58 minutes in. And John Strickland asked a question, and you started out talking. By 9 minutes later, Jane Hogaman spoke first for the council. She was very much in favor of the. 9 minutes later, you'd almost made a decision to build a new library, with no discussion about, if we have to have two buildings, what should stay and what should go. Now, I personally don't think we should try to put the archives down the road here. I don't think that's right, and I don't have a solution. If you were going to just build a new library on the green, which a lot of people want, not statistically, right, where would we put the archives? I know there were talks about the roast office. That didn't happen. There's other, but we are where we are.
John,
There's an interesting, as a side, there's an interesting letter from the entire Tufts family, signed by all of them, in 1996, recommending that the village build a new library.
1996?
Did I say that we have no better
Foresight of that
person
family.
to talk to the National Park Service than Jack Farrell?
now, first of all, John, thank you for raising the discussion a little bit. It was a healthy discussion. From the standpoint of the question you posed about whether or not you're crazy, I'm going to defer to Dr. Morgan. So,
And I'm an orthopedic surgeon, not a
Oh,
psychiatrist, so I'll check your knees. How about that?
You have subject matter expertise after all, so.
Okay.
but, so look, I think where we are is, you're going to at least reach out to the National Park Service, have a chat? I understand. And you will just try to figure out what you figure out. with
Yeah,
them
I can
Without,
get some cost estimates.
get
but-
some an idea of what's the minimal sketch. And then we can talk about it again. All right?
Perfect.
All right.
I'm quite content with that.
Now, where was I before I was asking?
I believe we
for-
had a motion
I
to.
thought we
adjourn.
had a motion.
Would now be happy to
Will
second.
someone second that motion?
Second.
That's it. We're adjourned.